Give a man a single nail and cast him onto a bare rock in the middle of the ocean. Most would die within 3 days. But Ethan Carver is an engineer, and he knows something you don't. A nail isn't just a nail. It's a wedge. It's a blade. It's the beginning of everything. The first thing he feels is salt. It burns his lips and stings his nostrils. He lies face down in a shallow puddle on a black rock and doesn't know if he's alive or not. His body aches as if it had been put through a press. He unclenches his fist, a rusty, forged nail, a finger's length long. He sits up, looks around. The ocean. No shore, no beach, not an island with palm trees. A bare, black rock the size of a tennis court in the middle of the water, stretching to the horizon in every direction. The sky is gray and low. No birds, no ships, not a single sign of life except for him and this nail. He stands on trembling legs, takes 3 steps toward the edge. Below, dark, bottomless water. Waves crash against the rock about 2 meters below. He steps back and crouches down. Assessment. That's how he was taught. Panic later. Resources first. No water, no food, no fire, no shelter. There's a rock. There's him. There's a nail. And right before his eyes, a translucent blue rectangle flashes into view. The letters glow with a soft light. Survival system loaded. Crafting skill, rank F. Available, 1 forged nail. Upgrade. He stares at the text for about 10 seconds. Then he laughs. Quietly at first, then louder. He laughs because if he doesn't laugh, all that's left is to scream. 1 nail, in the middle of the ocean, with the game system before his eyes. He rubs his face and forces himself to breathe steadily. He is an engineer, a builder. He spent 3 years designing coastal fortifications, 2 years restoring lighthouses. And if anyone can survive on bare rock with a single nail, it's a man who knows that a nail is not just a nail. A nail is a wedge, a scraper, a tip, an axle. He twists the nail between his fingers and sees it in a new light. The rust is superficial. The metal beneath is dense. The forging is old but high quality. He taps the word, upgrade. The nail trembles in his hand. The rust crumbles into dust. The metal darkens and hardens. A new inscription. The nail is improved. The recipe for a primitive chisel is available. Requires 1 flat stone. He looks down at his feet. Basalt, volcanic rock, hard but brittle if struck at the right angle. He crawls on all 4s, feeling every crack. In the center of the rock is a raised area. Around the edges are depressions where rainwater collects. 4 puddles. The largest is the size of a plate. There's enough water in it for 2 sips. He drinks 1, leaves the second. Then he finds what he was looking for. A thin crack in the basalt on the northern edge. He inserts a nail, point down, and strikes it from above with his palm. Pain shoots through his arm to his elbow. The stone doesn't budge. He strikes again, and again. On the 5th blow, it cracks. Not the stone. The skin on his palm bursts, and blood flows down his wrist. He hisses through clenched teeth. He tears a strip of fabric from his shirt and wraps it around his palm. He grabs a larger stone and hammers it against the nail head like a chisel. 20 minutes later, a flat piece of basalt the size of a palm breaks off from the edge of the cliff. A blue window flashes. Create a primitive chisel. He presses the nail against the stone. A glow envelops both objects. A second later, a crude but real adze lies in his hands. A stone slab with a blade made from a flattened nail. The edge is blunt, but it's a tool. His first tool. He looks up at the sky. The sun is somewhere behind the clouds, about 4 hours until dark. He stands up and gets to work. First is water. 4 puddles dry up in the wind faster than they fill up. He needs a collection system. He gets down on his knees and scrapes the basalt with a chisel. A line, another line, a groove as wide as a finger. The basalt is hard to cut. The chisel grinds, and his hands shake from the vibration. An hour later, a single groove 1 meter long. 2 or 3 hours later, 3 grooves leading from 3 depressions to a single point. A central hollow that he deepens by another couple of centimeters. It's all about the slope. He checks it with the shadow of a hammered-in nail. The water must flow on its own. No pumps. Just gravity and the right angle. When it gets dark, he lies curled up on a rock. His palms are worn down to the flesh. His stomach cramps with hunger. He stares at the black sky without a single familiar star. Even the constellations are foreign here. He closes his eyes. Everything is cold and wet. He wakes up to the sound of rain.
Drops are hitting his face. He jumps up and rushes to the grooves. The rain is heavy and steady. Water runs through the grooves in thin streams. 3 streams converge in the central hollow. It fills up. He kneels in the rain and watches the water collect. The slope is calculated correctly. The system works. By morning, there are 10 liters of clean water. The blue interface flashes. Craft's rank has been upgraded. F has changed to E. Stone masonry has been unlocked. 10 liters. 3 days of life if he conserves it. 3 days to solve the food problem. He doesn't know this world. He doesn't know its rules. He doesn't know its dangers. But he knows physics. He knows structural mechanics. He knows hydrodynamics. And he knows that anything can be built from stone and iron. The second day begins with an inventory. He walks around the perimeter of the rock, peering into every crevice. He searches for everything: cracks, shells, seaweed, moss in the northern crevice. The moss is dry and gray. Kindling. He gathers a handful of it. Then he climbs down to the water, holding on to the ledges. The waves crash so hard his legs tremble. On an underwater ledge about 30 centimeters below the surface, there's a cluster of large shells, mussels or something similar, food. But he has to reach them. He lies down on the edge and hangs over the side. He holds on with one hand. With the other, he wields the chisel. The wave hits his face and he nearly slips. Salt water floods his eyes. He pulls himself back up. He's breathing heavily. He tries again. He hooks the edge of a shell and pries it loose. It flies into the water. Third attempt. He drives the chisel under the base and levered it up. The shell bounces off the rock. A small victory. 2 hours later, he has 11 shells. His hands are cut by the sharp edges. Inside is tough, salty meat. He eats 5 of them raw. His stomach cramps, and for a moment he thinks he's going to throw up. But he holds it in. Protein, calories, life. He lays the remaining 6 out on a rock, a stash. On the 3rd day, the surf brings a gift. A piece of wood as long as his arm. A fin smoothed by the waves. He grabs it like a treasure. He taps it with a chisel. Solid, salt-cured but not rotten. His mind is already working. Not a stick, a lever. Not a stick, a spear.
He planes the fin with the chisel. The shavings fly, fine and light. An hour later, he has a smooth stick with a pointed tip. He goes down to the water and freezes. He waits. The sun breaks through the clouds. He sees a shadow. A fish, silvery, swimming along a rock 1/2 meter from the surface. He strikes. Misses. The fish darted away. He waits another hour. Strikes again. Misses again. By the 3rd hour, he realizes his mistake. Refraction. The water refracts the light. The fish isn't where he sees it. It's lower
and to the left. High school physics. He adjusts his aim. He strikes. The spear enters the water, and the tip pokes into something alive. The fish thrashes at the end of the pole, small but real. He pulls it onto the rock. His hands are shaking, not from the cold, from the fact that this fish means he can live here. Now for the fire. The moss is dry. He carves a hole in a piece of the fin with an adze. He inserts a thin stick chipped off the spear. He twists it with his palms, pressing it down. His palms are burning. The skin peels off. No smoke. 10 minutes. 20. 30. His palms are covered in blood. He twists it again.
After 40 minutes, a thin wisp of smoke rises from the hole. He stops breathing. He adds a pinch of moss. He blows on it. The moss flares up, a small red flame. He feeds it with shavings, then with splinters. The fire grows. A small fire on a black rock in the middle of the endless ocean. He spears the fish on a stick and holds it over the fire. The fat drips and sizzles on the stone. The smell of grilled fish is the best smell of his life. He eats it whole, bones and all, head and all. He licks the stick clean and sits by the fire watching the sunset. The sky is orange and purple. The ocean glows with reflected light. For the first time in 3 days, his stomach doesn't hurt. There's water, there's food, there's fire. The 3 basic needs are met. Now, shelter, tools, growth. The interface shows rank E. Stone masonry is unlocked. Tomorrow. Sleep now. He lies down by the dying fire and closes his eyes. The wind whistles. Waves crash against the rocks. Foreign stars burn overhead. And he doesn't dream of home. Not his mother, not his past life. He dreams of a wall. A tall stone wall stretching up into the sky. And he builds it stone by stone. And every stone fits perfectly. The 4th day began with a discovery. Overnight, the surf had washed a long plank onto the eastern edge of the cliff, darkened by the water, with a rusty nail sticking out of one end. Ethan picked it up and examined it. Ship planking. Oak, or something like oak. Dense, heavy wood, reeking of salt but sturdy. And a nail. A second nail. He pulled it out with his chisel and held 2 pieces of iron in his hand. The first had already become part of the chisel. The second was still intact. The system flashed. New material detected. Available recipe, primitive knife. Requires 1 forged nail, 1 whetstone. A whetstone. Ethan knew that basalt was too coarse, but on the underwater part of the rock he saw smoother outcrops. He went down to the water and dove in. The cold stung his skin. He opened his eyes underwater and saw a wall of rock plunging down into the darkness. At a depth of 5 feet, a ledge of a different rock jutted out, lighter in color, smoother. He chipped off a piece with a chisel, working with one hand underwater and holding onto the rock with the other. His lungs were burning. He surfaced, gasping for air. In his hand was a piece of gray stone, dense, fine-grained, similar to slate. It would work. Ethan sat down on the rock, wet and shivering. He activated the recipe. The nail touched the stone. A glow envelops them. A second later, a knife lay in his hand. Rough. The blade was short and wide, but sharp, really sharp. He ran his finger along the edge and a drop of blood appeared. A knife. Now he could cut, carve, chisel. The world had doubled in size. For the next 3 days, Ethan worked non-stop, knife and chisel in hand. A plank became a workbench, not a real one, just a flat surface on 2 stone supports.
but he could work on it. He carved pegs out of the fin. He hammered them into cracks in the rock. He stretched strips of cloth torn from his shirt between them. The result was a fish dryer. He caught 2 or 3 fish a day. He ate some right away. He dried some in the wind. On the 6th day, the ocean brought another piece of wood, 3 planks, a piece of mast as thick as a leg, a 4-meter-long piece of rope. Ethan looked at this bounty, and his mind was already drawing up plans. The piece of mast would be the support post. The planks would be the walls. The rope would be the fasteners. A shelter. He could build a shelter. He dug the mast fragment into a crevice in the rock and wedged it with stones. The post stood crooked. He propped it up with 2 flat stones. Better. He leaned the planks against the post at an angle, one edge on a stone, the other in the air. Secured it with the rope, tied it down. He checked it. The structure was swaying in the wind. He added 2 more stones to the base. There was no roof, but one wall already provided shelter from the wind. Ethan crawled under the shelter, and for the first time in a week, the wind wasn't blowing in his face. A small victory. The system was silent. The shelter was too simple to raise his rank. He needed something more complex. On the 7th day, Ethan crouched down and thought. A chisel, a knife. What next? An axe. He needed an axe. A knife was too small for serious woodwork. An axe is a blade on a handle. He had a blade, or rather, he might have one. He looked at the chisel, a stone blade with an iron insert. If he remade the mount and turned the blade perpendicular to the handle, he'd have an axe. But the system wouldn't let him take objects apart, only improve them and create new things. He needed more iron. Ethan went down to the water and began examining the underwater part of the cliff. He dived again and again, holding his breath for 1.5 minutes. The water was freezing. His body didn't freeze, but he kept diving. On his 5th dive, at a depth of 3 meters, he saw something embedded in the rock. Dark, reddish from rust. He surfaced for air and dove again. He swam closer. It was a piece of metal. Thick, bent, like a fragment of an anchor chain. 2 links fused with the basalt. Iron. Real iron. But it sat dead in the rock. He struck it with a chisel underwater. His hands slipped. He was running out of air. He surfaced, coughing and swallowing water. Dived back down. Hit it again. By evening he had pried out 1 link. A piece of rusty iron the size of a fist. Heavy, rough, beautiful. The system lit up. Material detected. Sea iron, low quality. Available recipe, small hatchet. Ethan activated the recipe right on the shore, wet and shivering from the cold. A glow enveloped the chain link and the piece of fin. 2 seconds later, a hatchet lay in his hands. Small. A blade made of remelted sea iron on a wooden handle, rough but sturdy. He swung it and struck the board. The blade sank a centimeter into the wood. A clean, even cut. Ethan laughed, a short, hoarse laugh from a man who, a week ago, had nothing but a nail. Now he had a knife and a hatchet and a chisel and a shelter and a supply of dried fish and 10 liters of water in a stone bowl. Kraft's rank remained E. The system was waiting for something more. The 8th day, the 9th, the 10th. Ethan chopped fins and built. The shelter was turning into a frame. 4 posts, crossbeams. He tied them together with rope and wedged them with wooden spikes. He sheathed the walls with planks washed up by the surf. The ocean fed him building materials, slowly but surely. Every day something washed up on the rock, a plank, a piece of log, a scrap of net, a barrel cork. Ethan collected everything, sorted it, arranged it by purpose. Wood by itself, ropes by themselves, metal by itself. trash by itself. An engineer throws nothing away. An engineer sees a function in every object. By the end of the second week, a shelter stood on the rock, with 3 walls and a roof made of planks laid with seaweed for waterproofing. Inside was a workbench, a shelf made of flat stones.
A fire pit lined with stones, with a smoke hole in the roof. Ethan sat inside and listened to the rain on the roof. The drops pounded on the wood, not on his head. He was dry, warm, with 3 days' worth of food. The system was silent. But he knew what it needed. It needed something fundamentally new, not an improvement on what already existed. A creation. He thought about this as he lay on a bed of dry seaweed. What he could create from what he had. Stone, wood, a little iron, rope. The answer came on the 16th day, when the surf washed up a dead bird. A large seagull, or something like a seagull, white with gray wings. Ethan looked at it and saw not a carcass. He saw materials. Bones, feathers, tendons, fat, skin. He butchered the bird with a knife. He roasted the meat and ate it. He collected the fat in half a large shell. He dried the bones. He tied the feathers into a bundle. He stretched the skin over a stone. And from the bones and tendons, he assembled something the system had not yet seen in this world. A bellows. Small blacksmith's bellows made of seagull skin stretched over a bone frame with a feather valve. When pressed, the bellows emitted a directed stream of air. Weak, but directed. Ethan built a stone chamber around the bellows. He loaded inside pieces of charcoal left over from the campfires. He blew the bellows. The coals flared up. The temperature inside the chamber rose. He placed a scrap of iron he'd pried from the bottom into the fire. The iron began to glow red, slowly, but it began. Furnace. A primitive blacksmith's furnace made of stones and bird bones. The system flared up brighter than ever. Crafting rank increased. E changed to D. Basic forging unlocked. Primitive casting unlocked. 3 new recipes available. Ethan stared at the blue letters and his hands trembled. Not from the cold, from realization. Forging. He could now forge. Change the shape of metal. From a piece of rusty chain, he could make anything. A hammer, pliers, nails, hinges, staples, hooks. The world had just become 10 times bigger. He picked up a piece of iron heated to a dark red glow and placed it on a flat stone. He picked up another stone, heavy, round, and struck. Sparks flew. The iron flattened. He struck again, and again. He struck until the piece turned into a flat plate. Then he folded it. He heated it again. He struck it again. Fold, heat. Strike. He did this just as he had been taught in his metallurgy course. Not blacksmithing. He had never studied forging. But he knew the theory. He knew that folding and hammering even out the metal structure. They drive out the slag. They make the iron stronger. By nightfall, he had a strip of metal the length of his palm, smooth, solid, without pits or cracks. You could make anything out of it. He made a hammer. A real hammer with an iron head and a wooden handle. Wedged in, set while hot, just as it should be. Just as the old restorer at the lighthouse in Oregon had taught him. The hammer fit his hand perfectly. The weight was right. The balance was right. Ethan struck a stone with it. The sound was clear and ringing. He sat by the forge with the hammer in his hand and watched the fire. 2.5 weeks ago, he had a single rusty nail. Now he has a knife, a hatchet, a chisel, a hammer, a forge, a shed, a workbench, a supply of food, water, and a D rank in the system that showed him recipes this world hadn't even dreamed of. He set the hammer down on the workbench and went to sleep. Tomorrow, he would start building for real.
On the 20th day, Ethan forged his first hinge, a door hinge made of 2 plates with a nail for an axle. That very first nail he had remelted and reforged 3 times already. The nail had become thinner and longer. The metal had become denser. Each remelting had driven the slag and impurities out of it. Ethan held the hinge in his palm and turned it. The plates moved freely. No sticking, no play. Clean work. He hung the hinge on the shed frame and fitted a door made of 3 planks held together by a crossbar. The door opened and closed, smoothly, with a quiet creak. Ethan stood in front of the door and looked at it. A door. He now had a door. Not a rag curtain, not a shield propped against the wall, a real door on hinges. He opened it, closed it, opened it again. Then he chuckled quietly and shook his head. The system was silent. The door was fine, but for the new rank, he needed something more substantial. Ethan knew exactly what. A wall. Not the wooden siding of a shed, a stone wall. The system had unlocked stone masonry for him back at rank E, but he hadn't used that skill. There was no mortar. Stones without mortar are just a pile of stones. The wind will blow them away. A wave will wash them away. He needed cement, or at least lime, or clay. He dove toward the underwater part of the cliff, and this time he wasn't looking for iron. He was looking for other types of rock. At a depth of 4 meters, he found a layer of something whitish and soft, crumbly. He chipped off a piece and brought it up. Limestone, or something very similar. Soft, crumbles in your fingers. If you burn it, you get quicklime. If you pour water on it, you get slaked lime. If you mix it with sand, you get mortar. Sand. Where to get sand? Ethan looked around. The rock was black and smooth. No sand. But he looked at the shells. Dozens of empty shells had piled up near his camp over the past 3 weeks. Shells are calcium carbonate. If he ground them into powder and mixed them with burnt limestone, he smiled. Improvisation. His whole project was one big improvisation. It took 3 days to gather enough limestone from the seabed. He dived 20 times a day. He'd surface blue and shivering. He'd pile the stones into a heap, dry them, then load them into the kiln and fire them. The kiln was small and weak. It could only handle 2 or 3 pieces per firing. He worked from dawn until dark, firing, quenching in water, crushing the shells stone against stone, mixing. The first batch of mortar turned out runny and gray. He smeared it between 2 stones and left it overnight. By morning, the mortar had set. The stones held. Not perfectly. The mortar crumbled at the edges, but they held. Ethan adjusted the proportions. More lime, less water, finely crushed shells. The second batch was better. The third, even better. By the 25th day, he began building the wall. He cut the stones from the rock with a hatchet and a chisel. Basalt split into even blocks if struck along the layers. He'd learned that during the first week. Now that knowledge worked in his favor. Block by block, row by row, mortar between them. He checked the level with a plumb line, a rope with a stone at the end. The simplest tool known to builders for 5,000 years. The wall grew slowly, 10 centimeters a day, 20. His hands ached, his back ached, his knees ached from standing on the stone. But the wall grew. On the 28th day, it reached waist height. On the 30th day, a meter. Ethan stood before it and watched. A meter-high stone wall of basalt blocks set in lime mortar. Crooked, not perfect, with drips of mortar and cracks in the corners, but standing. Sturdy. He nudged it with his shoulder. It didn't budge. The system flashed. Craft rank upgraded. D changed to C. Basic fortification unlocked. Stoneworking unlocked. 2 new recipes available. Ethan sat down on the ground, leaning his back against his wall. Rank C. In a month. Local craftsmen had been working toward this for years, but the local masters did the same thing over and over. They copied the recipes of their fathers and grandfathers. The system didn't reward repetition. The system rewarded innovation. And for Ethan, every project was new because he was bringing knowledge from another world. A horn made of bird bones, mortar made of seashells, a plumb line made of rope. To this world, all of this was an invention. For Ethan, it was a second-year textbook. The days passed. The wall grew. Ethan used it to enclose the northern part of the cliff where the shed stood. It turned into a courtyard, a small one, 5 by 5 meters, but sheltered from the wind on 3 sides. In this courtyard, he set up the forge in a permanent spot.
He built a stone table. He made shelves for tools. A knife hung on a hook on the wall, a hatchet nearby, a hammer on the workbench, a chisel by the forge. Every tool in its place. Order. Organization. A workshop. On the 35th day, he remelted all the metal he had collected from the bottom and from the keel. 6 nails, 3 pieces of chain, a fragment of an unidentifiable iron object resembling part of a lock. Everything went into the forge. Everything was remelted, reforged. This resulted in a set. A hammer, a chisel, 24 nails, a wood staple, and a small chisel. Ethan laid out the tools on the workbench and looked at them. A month ago, he had a single nail. Now he had a workshop, a wall, tools, a week's supply of food, a water collection system expanded to 3 bowls. He was surviving. No, he was no longer surviving. He was living and building. On the 40th day, Ethan began the main project of his first month. A tower. Not a big one, 3 meters, stone masonry with mortar. A square base, 1 meter by 1 meter, tapered toward the top. A platform for a fire at the top. A lighthouse. A small lighthouse on a bare rock in the middle of the ocean. Why? Because a lighthouse is a signal, a light in the darkness. It tells ships that there is land here, that they can dock here, that someone lives here. Ethan didn't want to be alone. He built it for 3 weeks, block by block, row by row. He mixed the mortar every morning. He burned the limestone every evening. His hands grew rough, calluses upon calluses. His palms were yellow from the lime dust. His nails wore down to the flesh. His back wouldn't straighten in the mornings. He'd wake up hunched over and couldn't stand up for the first 10 minutes. Then he'd stretch. Then he'd go to the wall. Then he worked until dark. On the 45th day, the tower was 1.5 meters high. On the 50th, 2.5 meters. On the 55th, 3 meters. At the top was a platform made of flat stones. On the platform was a stone fire bowl. Ethan poured fish fat into it and set it alight. The flame was small and yellow, but it was burning. At night, it was visible from the water. He hoped it was visible. He couldn't check for himself. He had no way to go out to sea. He stood on the tower's platform and looked out at the ocean. The wind blew in his face. The flame flickered behind him. All around was only water. Endless. Dark. Indifferent. And he was alone on a rock in the middle of it. The lighthouse is lit. Someone will see it. They must see it. The system was silent. The tower was good, but it was made of already known materials and techniques. For the new rank, something fundamentally different is needed. Ethan thought about this every evening while sitting by the lighthouse. He had mastered stone. He had mastered wood. He had mastered iron. What next? Glass?
Ceramics? Concrete? Mechanisms? But all of that required materials that weren't on the rock. Clay, sand, coal, copper. He needed the ocean. He needed what the ocean brought. And he needed patience. He waited. He built. He reinforced the walls. He expanded the catchment. He caught fish. He dried meat. And he waited. The ocean was generous in its own way. Every day it brought something. On the 58th day, a bundle of bamboo washed up against the rock. Long stalks tied together with a frayed rope. Ethan dragged them onto the rock and counted them. 12 stalks, each as thick as an arm and about 3 meters long. Bamboo. Light, strong, flexible, hollow. You can make anything out of bamboo.
Water pipes, a frame, rafters, furniture, weapons, a fishing rod, finally. He worked for 2 days straight with almost no sleep. He cut the stalks, split them, planed them, assembled them. From the bamboo, he made a frame to extend the canopy. The roof became twice as large. From the bamboo, he made a water gutter, from the water collection channels to the new stone cistern he had carved out of the rock a week earlier. Now rainwater flowed through the bamboo gutter straight into the sealed cistern. It didn't evaporate. It didn't get contaminated. He made a fishing rod out of bamboo, a real one, with a line made of braided tendons and a bone hook. Fishing became 3 times more effective. He made a ladder to the tower out of bamboo. Before that, he'd climb up the rocks, clinging with his hands. Now there was a ladder, with steps, with a railing. A man-made thing. On the 60th day, 2 months on the cliff. Ethan sat on the top platform of the tower and watched the sunset. He had a home, a workshop, a wall, a lighthouse, tools, food, water. He had lost about 10 kilograms. His hands had become sinewy and dark from the sun. His face was weathered. His beard had grown out, and he trimmed it with a knife. He was alone. 60 days alone. 60 days talking to himself and to the system, which didn't answer. 60 nights falling asleep to the sound of the waves and waking up in silence. He didn't go mad. He was too busy for that. But at night, when the work was done and his body lay on the mat and his brain was still buzzing with exhaustion, the nights were hard. He thought about his mother, about how she sat alone in her house in Portland, not knowing that her son was dead, or not dead, or dead in a different way. He thought about how he hadn't called her that last day off, how he'd meant to, how the phone had been lying on the table, how he'd told himself, "I'll call tomorrow." And tomorrow never came. He clenched his fists in the dark and bit down on his own silence. And in the morning, he'd get up and started building. Because if he stopped, that would be it. If he sat down and really thought about where he was, what was happening to him, and whether there was a way back, if he allowed himself to do that, he wouldn't get up. That's why he built. On the morning of the 61st day, Ethan stood on the edge of a cliff with a spyglass. The spyglass was made of bamboo, 2 cylinders of different diameters, one inserted into the other. There were no lenses. The spyglass didn't magnify anything. It simply cast a shadow and helped him focus his gaze on the horizon. And on the horizon, he saw a dark dot. It was moving, slowly, but moving. It was getting closer. Ethan watched without looking away. The dot grew larger. An hour later, he could make out the outline. Not a ship, a wreckage. A large piece of shipwreck. A stern or a side. Dark wood. Torn sailcloth. And something was lying on the wreckage, or someone. The wreckage was approaching slowly. The current was carrying it past the rock. Ethan realized that if he didn't intercept it, in an hour the wreckage would pass 100 meters away and drift further out into the ocean.
along with whoever was lying on it. He had no boat. He had no rope long enough. He had bamboo. Ethan acted on instinct. He grabbed 4 bamboo stalks. He tied them together with a rope, crisscrossing them. It turned into a raft. Ugly, unreliable, but it floated. He pushed it off the edge of the cliff into the water and jumped in after it. The cold hit him in the chest. He clung to the bamboo and began paddling with his hands. The raft wouldn't obey him. The waves tossed it about, carried it off to the side. Ethan paddled until he was hoarse. His hands burned from the salt. The wreckage was 50 meters away, 30, 20. He made out a figure on the planks, a person, small, lying face down, dark hair, tattered clothes, not moving. 10 meters away, 5. Ethan reached the edge of the wreckage and grabbed a protruding plank. He pulled the raft closer, clambered onto the wreckage. The plank swayed and creaked. He crawled toward the figure and turned her onto her back. A girl, young, her face sunburned, her lips chapped and bleeding, her eyes closed. He pressed his ear to her chest. Her heart was beating, weakly but beating. She's breathing, alive. Ethan looked around. The wreckage was large, about 5 meters long, part of the stern of a merchant ship. Things were stuck in the cracks between the planks. A coil of soggy rope, a piece of sailcloth, a wooden box tied to a frame, a broken lantern made of yellow metal, brass. Ethan memorized everything. Then he returned to the girl. He needed to get her to the cliff, and the wreckage, too. Too much stuff to leave behind. He untied the rope from the wreckage and tied it to the bamboo raft. Then he tied the raft to the wreckage so it wouldn't drift away. It made a makeshift bundle, clumsy but intact. He jumped into the water and began pushing the whole contraption toward the rock. He kicked with his feet. He braced his shoulder against the wet wood. The current pulled him sideways. He fought it for 20 minutes, 30. His hands were going numb. His legs were cramping, but the rock was already close. 10 meters. 5. He pushed the log into a narrow cove between the rocks on the south side of the cliff. The wood scraped across the basalt. Ethan climbed onto the rock and dragged the rope up. He tied it to a ledge. The log swayed in the cove, but held. Then he climbed back down and lifted the girl. She weighed as much as a child. Her bones jutted out beneath her skin. Dehydration, starvation, burns. He carried her over the rocks up to the camp. He laid her on a bed of seaweed under the shelter. He brought water in a shell. He lifted her head and began to pour it in, drop by drop. The water ran down her chin. She wasn't swallowing. He took water into his mouth and gently pressed his lips to hers. He poured in a thin stream. She coughed, swallowed, coughed again. Her eyes opened, dark, cloudy, unseeing. She was looking right through him. Then her eyes closed again. But she was breathing more evenly and swallowing the water. Ethan sat beside her and poured water down her throat every 10 minutes. Between sips, he went outside and dismantled the wreckage. He pried the planks apart with a hatchet. He unwound the rope. He hoisted the box up onto the rock in one piece. He set the brass lantern aside. Brass. The first non-ferrous metal, softer than iron, melts more easily. You can make things out of brass that won't work with iron. Fine details, bushings, rivets. He returned to the girl. She was asleep. Her breathing was steady. Her pulse was steadier. Ethan covered her with a sailcloth from the wreckage and went outside. He opened the wooden box. Inside, the contents were damp but not rotten. Navigation charts, rolled up into a tube. The ink had smudged, but the lines were legible. Islands, straits. Notes in a language he didn't know. A compass. A small brass compass with a cracked glass face. The needle was moving. It worked. A leather pouch with instruments. a ruler, a compass, a protractor, all brass, all wet but intact. Navigation instruments. The girl was a navigator. Ethan sat in front of the open box and looked at the maps. For the first time in 2 months, he saw proof that there were other people in this world. There were islands, there were cities, there was civilization. He wasn't alone in the void. He was just at the edge of the map. The girl woke up on the second day. Ethan was sitting by the forge, reforging a bracket, when a hoarse voice sounded behind him. She was speaking in a language he didn't know. He turned around. She was sitting on a mat, looking at him. Her eyes were dark. Her face was swollen from burns. Her hair was black, matted with salt. She spoke quickly and fearfully. Ethan raised his hands, palms forward, slowly, showing he was unarmed. Then he pointed to the water, to the food, to her. She fell silent and watched. He took a shell filled with water and held it out to her. She looked at him for about 3 seconds. Then she took it and drank it in one gulp. He gave her some dried fish. She ate greedily and choked. He gestured for her to slow down. She nodded. She ate more slowly. They looked at each other. 2 people on a rock in the middle of the ocean, with no common language. She pointed at herself and said one word. May. He pointed at himself. Ethan. She repeated it. Ethan. He nodded. Then he gestured around, at the walls, at the tower, at the horn, at the instruments. May looked and didn't understand. She saw stone walls and a tower in the middle of the empty ocean, and couldn't reconcile that with a single person. She pointed at the walls and held up her fingers. How many people? Ethan held up one finger. She shook her head. She didn't believe him. He shrugged. A week later, May began speaking his language. Not fluently, just individual words, pointing at objects and repeating after him. Stone, water, fish, fire, knife, wall, door. Ethan pointed and named them. She memorized them instantly. Navigator. She was used to learning the languages of ports and trading posts. By the second week, she was forming sentences, short ones, simple ones, but understandable. She told him she had been captaining a merchant ship, a crew of 20. A storm smashed the ship against the reef. She was alone on the wreckage, 3 days in the ocean. She was sure she would die. Then she saw the lighthouse's light, and the current carried her toward the rock. The lighthouse had worked. Ethan listened and nodded. Something tightened inside him. He had built the lighthouse so that someone would see it. Someone did see it. But there was something else in her eyes. She wasn't just talking about the shipwreck. She was avoiding one word. Course. When Ethan asked who had chosen the course through the storm, May fell silent. She looked away. Then she said quietly that she had chosen it. She had insisted on the course. The captain wanted to sail around the storm. She said they would make it. They didn't. 20 people died because she made a mistake. She said this in a steady voice, looking out at the ocean, not at Ethan, at the ocean she now feared. Ethan saw how she turned away from the water, how she sat with her back to the sea, how she flinched at the sound of the waves at night. He didn't say anything to her. He didn't try to comfort her. He didn't say she wasn't to blame. He didn't know if she was to blame or not. He knew only one thing. She needed a place where the ocean wasn't scary. On the 3rd day after May told him about the shipwreck, Ethan began to build. Not a wall, not a tower. A bay window. A small addition to the porch on the east wall. Stone walls on 3 sides, a roof of planks, and one window, glazed. He didn't have any glass, but he had brass from a lantern. He melted it in a furnace and cast a thin frame. Then he took a piece of mica he'd found in a crevice in the rock a week ago. a thin sheet of translucent mineral. He inserted it into the frame. It turned into a window. A bit cloudy, but through it he could see the ocean, blue and distant. Beyond the glass, behind the wall, safe. The bay window was small, 1 meter by 1 meter. A stone bench by the wall, a shelf for maps and tools, and a window overlooking the ocean. Ethan led May to the bay window and opened the door. She stepped inside. She saw the window. She stopped. She stood there, gazing at the ocean through the cloudy mica. The ocean was there, behind the wall, behind the glass. He couldn't reach it. She could look at it and be safe. She stood there for a long time. Then she sat down on the stone bench. Then she turned away. Ethan saw her shoulders shaking. He went out and closed the door. Quiet. The system flashed, but not the rank. Something else. A new recipe unlocked. Personalized object. A bonus to crafting quality when creating an item for a specific user. Ethan looked at the inscription and slowly understood. The system rated the bay window higher than the tower, higher than the wall, because the tower was for everyone, and the bay window was for May. An item for a specific person, made for a specific need. The system sees this. The system values this. He sat down by the wall and thought. An object for a person, not an object in general. That had been his principle even in his past life. He had never designed an abstract lighthouse. He designed a lighthouse for a specific cape with specific winds and a specific keeper. And here, that rule applies, even more so. May came out of the bay window an hour later. Her eyes were red. Her face was wet. But she was looking at the ocean, without turning away. For the first time in 2 weeks, she walked over to Ethan and said 2 words. "Thank you, Ethan." Then she went back to her spot and lay down. Ethan sat by the wall and watched the sunset. He was no longer alone. 2 of them, on a rock in the middle of the ocean, with a single nail forged into 100 things, with a tower that burns at night. And now with a bay window where the girl is learning to look at the sea again. On the 61st day, a shipwreck washed up on the rock with the sole survivor, Manhwa, navigator of a merchant ship. Ethan saved her and set out. From the wreckage, he obtained maps and the first non-ferrous metal, brass. May bears the guilt for the deaths of 20 people and is afraid of the ocean. Ethan built a glassed-in bay window for her with a view of the sea, and the system unlocked a new principle. A personalized object grants a bonus to crafting quality when an item is created for a specific person. May turned out to be more useful than Ethan could have imagined. After 3 weeks, she spoke fluently enough to explain complex matters. She knew the maps, she knew the currents, she knew the trade routes and pirate paths. She knew the names of the islands and the distances between them. Ethan's Rock was located in a place sailors called the Bone Wasteland, a triangle of open ocean where there were no islands, no reefs, and no trade routes. Ships gave it a wide berth. The currents here swirled into a vortex that sucked in debris and flotsam. That was why the ocean washed up so much driftwood and rubbish. That was why it had washed May ashore here. The nearest inhabited island of the Gray Spires archipelago lay 100 nautical miles to the southeast. Port Cross Tide, a pirate's den. The capital of the Western Waters, the domain of Captain Bartholomew Grave, nicknamed Black Anchor. May uttered that name and fell silent. Ethan asked what kind of man he was. May searched for words for a long time. Then she said that Grave was no bandit. Grave was a philosopher. He believed that the ocean should belong to no one, that anyone who tries to erect a wall, a lighthouse, or a fortress on the water goes against the nature of the sea. He sinks merchants not for the sake of gold. He sinks them because trade routes are an attempt to tame the ocean. Ethan listened and nodded silently. A philosopher with cannons. He knew people like that. They are the most dangerous. 200 miles to the southwest lay the White Surf Archipelago, the territory of the Kingdom of Albatross, the last state that tried to uphold the law at sea. They had a fleet, they had ports, they had shipyards, but they were losing. Pirates were sinking their ships faster than the shipyards could build new ones. There weren't enough craftsmen, there weren't enough resources. Young men were joining the pirates because the pay was better. Albatross was dying a slow death, and everyone could see it. May spread the map out on the workbench and pointed things out. Ethan looked at the lines and markings. His engineer's mind was working. Distances, currents, winds. His rock stood at the intersection of three major routes. From the gray spires to the north, from white surf to the east, from the far volcanoes to the west. Whoever controls this point controls the triangle. But no one controlled it because there was nothing to control here. A bare rock in an empty sea. Until an engineer with the craft system appeared on the rock. Ethan rolled up the map and said nothing. But lines were already forming in his mind. Lines, walls, bastions, a pier, a breakwater, echeloned defenses. He knew how to build fortresses. It was his specialty. 3 years of coastal fortifications, 2 years of lighthouses, firing angles, dead zones, crossfire. For him, it wasn't magic, it was a textbook. But first, he needed more people, more materials, and more time. The 70th day, the 10th week. Ethan and May worked as a team. She turned out to be stronger than she looked. Her hands were small but sinewy. She tied knots faster than he did. She wove ropes from plant fibers. She mended sails. She knew 20 types of nautical knots, each for its own load. And Ethan built. May helped and learned. She watched him work and asked questions. Why is the angle like that? Why do you lay the stone with the long side facing in? Why is the mortar wet and not dry? Ethan explained, simply and briefly. Because the long side facing in is jointing. The wall becomes a monolith, not a stack of... Because the mortar is wet to fill the voids, dry mortar will crack. May listened and nodded. Then she did it herself. Not perfectly, but better each time. The system wouldn't give her a craft rank. May had her own skill. Navigation. Rank B, high. She could see the stars and knew her location down to the mile. She could see the clouds and knew what the wind would be like in 6 hours. She could see the color of the water and knew the depth. Her skill didn't help with building, but it helped her survive. She predicted storms a day in advance. She knew at what times the current brought in the most flounder. She knew when the fish approached the rocks and when they retreated to deeper waters. Together, the two of them were 3 times more efficient. On the 75th day, Ethan began to expand the wall. One wall to the north protected them from the wind. Now he was building a second one to the west, and a third to the east, closing the perimeter. The stonework went faster with an assistant. May brought the stones. She mixed the mortar. She held the plumb line while Ethan leveled the blocks. The walls grew. By the 85th day, 3 walls stood along the perimeter of the cliff. The southern side remained open. There was a descent to the water there, a future dock. Ethan left an opening for a gate, a real gate which he couldn't build yet. There wasn't enough iron for hinges of that size. For now, the opening was covered with a shield of planks. But there was a plan. There was always a plan. Inside the perimeter, there were now 30 square meters of protected space. The workshop canopy took up a third. The lighthouse stood in the northeast corner, the horn by the west wall, a place for a fire in the center, May's alcove on the east wall. Between them remained the living space, May slept in the shed on her bedding. Ethan slept by the horn. They didn't discuss it. It just worked out that way. Day 85. Ethan was working on a new project. His old profession was nagging at him, a desalination unit. Rainwater is good, but it didn't rain every day. Sometimes 3 or 4 days without rain, and the supply would dwindle. He needed a stable source. Seawater all around. Endless, but salty. The principle of desalination is simple. Heat the salt water, steam rises. Steam is pure water. Collect the steam, cool it. You get fresh water. Distillation, high school physics. Ethan built a desalination unit in 5 days. A stone basin for salt water on a stand. A bamboo tube to carry the steam away. The tube ran through a stone trough filled with cold seawater. The steam cooled in the tube and condensed. The droplets flowed into a collecting shell at the other end. Slowly, drop by drop, but steadily. 10 drops an hour, almost a glass a day. Not much, but this is only the first version. Ethan already saw how to improve it. More heating surface, a longer condenser tube, better thermal insulation. He'll refine it. The system lit up. A new type of object. Autonomous Life Support System. A bonus to progression. Kraft's rank didn't go up. It's too early for V. But the system noticed. It remembered. Every step in the right direction. May looked at the desalinator and couldn't believe her eyes. She pointed to a drop of water dripping from the tube and asked where it came from. Ethan explained. Salt water, steam, fresh water. May listened and shook her head. Then she said quietly that in 30 years at sea, she had never seen anything like it. Sailors carried fresh water in barrels. When the barrels ran out, people died. It was that simple. No one knew you could make water from steam. Ethan looked at her and realized something important. Knowledge that was basic to him, school stuff, obvious. Here, it was a treasure. Distillation. A lever. Meetings. A block. A gear. A bearing. Hydraulics. Thermodynamics. Everything he knew as an engineer. None of it existed here. Not because people were stupid, but because they lacked a foundation. There was no physics as a science. There was no systematic knowledge. There were crafts, traditions, recipes passed down from master to apprentice, but no understanding of the principles. Ethan could change that. Not one subject after another, but the very foundation. To teach people not what to do, but why it works. Day 90, 3 months. Ethan stood on the tower and looked at his fortress, the perimeter walls, the workshop, the horn, the desalinator, the water catchment, the fish dryer, the bay window, the lighthouse. 2 people, a single nail reforged 100 times and turned into a dozen tools. Rank C in the craft system, and he had only just begun. At night, the lighthouse burned, a dim yellow flame fueled by fish oil. But it burned. May predicted that in 2 days, the current would change and a southern current would flow along the cliff. A southern current meant fish, lots of fish, and maybe wreckage. The southern waters were teeming. Merchant ships sailed between the archipelagos there.
Pirates hunted caravans there. Wreckage from skirmishes drifted north, toward them. On the 93rd day, the southern current began. May was right. The fish came in schools. Ethan and May fished from morning till night. They dried them, smoked them over a low fire. Their food supply grew. And on the 95th day, May woke him before dawn. She stood over him, shaking his shoulder. Her face was serious. She said one word. Ship. Ethan jumped up and rushed to the tower. He climbed the bamboo ladder to the platform. He looked south. A silhouette on the horizon. Not a wreck. A ship. Small. Single-masted. The sail was torn. It was moving slowly. Rocking on the waves. May climbed up after him. She looked through his bamboo tube. A fishing boat. A fishing yalik. The mast was broken. The sail was a tattered remnant, drifting with the current. Ethan watched. The yalik was heading straight for the rock. The current was carrying it. In an hour it would be at the shore. They climbed down and waited by the southern opening in the wall. The yalik reached the cliff an hour and a half later. It was washed up against the rocks and got stuck in a crevice. There were people on board. 3 of them. An old man with a gray beard, a middle-aged woman with a bandage on her arm, and a boy of about 12 clinging to the side. All 3 were in terrible condition, dehydrated, sunburned. The old man couldn't stand. The woman was barely able to stay on her feet. The boy was conscious, but his eyes were vacant. Ethan and May hauled them onto the rock. They carried them to the camp. Water, food, shade, basic first aid. Ethan worked quickly. He checked everyone's pulse, examined them. The old man was the most dehydrated of all. The woman was injured. A cut on her forearm was inflamed and red. Infection. The boy was simply emaciated. They rehydrated them for 3 hours. Then the old man spoke. He spoke the same language as May. She translated. Their village on Little Spire Island had been burned down by pirates. Not Grave, a petty captain named Ratcliffe. He came for provisions. The village refused to pay. He burned the houses and killed those who resisted. They fled in a rowboat. 3 out of 60. They sailed for 5 days. No water, no direction. They saw the lighthouse's light last night, headed toward the light. The lighthouse. The lighthouse again. Ethan listened and said nothing. Then he stood up and went to the workshop. May caught up with him. She asked what he was doing. He said he needed to build 3 more sleeping berths and expand the desalinator and increase the food supply. 5 people now, not 2. We need 2.5 times more resources. May watched him. Then she quietly asked if he would take in everyone who sailed toward the light. Ethan stopped. He looked at the lighthouse, at the walls, at the ocean. Then he said that was why the lighthouse was lit. May nodded. She said nothing. But Ethan noticed she smiled. For the first time in all this time. The old man turned out to be a carpenter, a former carpenter. His name was Olaf. 20 years ago, he lost 3 fingers on his right hand to frostbite. He hadn't worked. He made a living fishing and mending nets. The woman's name was Bridget, Olaf's sister. The wound on her hand was from a pirate's boarding sword. The boy's name was Tom, Bridget's son, a quiet boy. He watched everything with wide eyes and didn't say a word. Ethan examined Bridget's wound. It was infected, but not deep. He rinsed the wound with boiled water. He applied a bandage made of clean cloth. He changed the bandage twice a day. After a week, the redness had subsided. Bridget began to walk normally and immediately got to work. She knew how to cook, sew, and mend sails. Tom followed her like a shadow, silent and wary. Olaf sat against the wall and looked at his hands. 2 fingers on his right, 3 on his left. Hands useless for a carpenter. He watched Ethan work, how he planed, how he split wood, how he carved. He watched for hours, silently, with an expression Ethan had seen before on the faces of the old men at the nursing home near the lighthouse in Oregon. The expression of a man who remembers what he could do and knows he can no longer. On the 100th day, at night when everyone was asleep, Ethan sat down at the workbench and worked by the light of an oil lamp. He carved 3 small tubes out of wood. Inside each one, he inserted a hinge from that very first hinge, the one he had forged from the first nail. He took the hinge into pieces. The axles became the hinge pins. The plates became the fasteners. He attached leather straps to the tubes, soft, custom-fitted. He had seen Olaf's hand.
He remembered the shape of the stumps, the length, the thickness, the angle. Prosthetics. 3 wooden prosthetics for 3 fingers, with hinges, with leather straps, with indentations for the stumps. Not perfect, rough, but functional. In the morning, he placed them next to Olaf, silently. The old man woke up and saw them. He picked up one prosthesis, looked at it, slipped it onto the stump of his index finger, tightened the strap. The prosthesis fit snugly. The hinge allowed him to bend the wooden finger, not fully, but enough to hold a tool. Olaf put on the second one, the third, looked at his hand, 3 wooden fingers and 2 living ones. He stood up, walked over to the workbench, picked up a plane, placed a board on it, ran the plane along the wood. The shavings curled into a thin, even spiral and fell to the floor. Olaf watched the shavings. Then he ran the plane over it again, another spiral. He worked until evening. He didn't say a word. He just planed board after board. By evening, a stack of perfectly planed boards lay next to him. Bridget stood in the doorway and cried quietly, pressing her hand to her mouth. Tom stood nearby and smiled for the first time.
May sat on the tower steps and watched Ethan. He didn't notice. He was already sketching a plan for the smithy's expansion on a stone. The system flashed brightly. Personalized, high-order object. An item created to restore a specific person's lost function. Progression bonus doubled. Craft rank increased from C to B. Applied mechanics unlocked. Structural engineering unlocked. 4 new recipes. Ethan stared at the blue letters. Rank B. In 100 days. Mechanics. Engineering. The system was giving him what he already knew, but now it was confirming it, showing him the recipes of this world based on principles he had brought from his own. Gears, bearings, lever systems, counterweight blocks. All of this existed in his head. Now it existed in the system, too. He closed his eyes and stood on the tower platform. The wind blew in his face. 5 people on the cliff, walls around the perimeter, the workshop, the horn, the lighthouse. 100 days. A single nail. And so much work still ahead that thinking about it was terrifying and wonderful at the same time. Olaf had changed everything, not because he was a great master, but because he was a carpenter with 40 years of experience who could finally hold a tool again. Ethan built with stone and iron. Olaf built with wood. Together, they complemented each other. On the 105th day, Olaf looked at the shed and shook his head. Then, silently, he picked up a plane and began to rebuild it. In 3 days, the shed turned into a house. Not a shack, a house. The walls were sheathed with tongue-and-groove boards. The roof had the proper pitch. The rafters were cut into the wall plate as they should be. Ethan watched Olaf work and understood the difference between an engineer and a carpenter. An engineer knows why. A carpenter knows how. Together they did things they couldn't do separately. Ethan drew the plans. Olaf built. Ethan calculated the load. Olaf selected the wood by touch and sound. Ethan knew the theory. Olaf knew the material. Tom started speaking on the 12th day after his arrival. The first word he said was, hammer. He stood next to Ethan and watched him forge. Then he pointed to the hammer and said, hammer. Ethan handed him the tool. Tom took it with both hands. It was heavy for a 12-year-old, but the boy held it firmly. From that day on, Tom became an apprentice, quiet and attentive. He handed tools, pumped the bellows, brought stones, cleared away shavings. He did everything he was asked to do, and did nothing without being asked. Bridget took charge of the kitchen. That word sounded grand for a campfire and 3 seashells. But she turned the campfire into a hearth. She replaced the seashells with stone plates that Ethan had fired. She roasted fish with seaweed and herbs she found in the cracks of the rock.
Food became more than just calories. Food became food, with flavor, with a scent that woke them up in the morning. 5 people on the rock. Each did their own part, and the rock began to turn into a settlement. On the 110th day, Ethan began building a pier. Not a stone pier. There wasn't enough strength or material for that. A wooden pier on stone supports. Olaf carved the pilings from the thickest logs the surf had washed ashore. Ethan drove them into the crevices on the south side of the rock and filled them with mortar. 3 piles, then crossbeams, then a deck of planks. The pier turned out small, 3 meters long and 1 meter wide, but they could tie a boat to it. If they had a boat. On the 115th day, the ocean brought the gift Ethan had been dreaming of. A storm. A strong one. May had predicted it 2 days earlier. They prepared. They secured everything that could blow away. They went inside. They closed the door. The storm pounded the cliff for 14 hours. Waves crashed over the walls. The wind howled through the cracks. The lighthouse went dark. Tom sat huddled against his mother. Olaf slept. May stood by the bay window and watched the storm through the glass, without looking away. Ethan noticed this. She watched the storm and didn't tremble. Progress. In the morning, the storm had passed. Ethan went out first and stopped. The southern shore of the cliff was littered with debris. Planks, logs, scraps of rope, pieces of planking, a barrel. A whole barrel with a cork in it. And most importantly, a mast. A whole mast, 7 meters long, lay across the pier, wedged between the pilings. Pine, straight, sturdy. Ethan stood and watched. Olaf came out after him and whistled. Then he said that they could build a rowboat from this mast. A small one, but a real one. Ethan looked at Olaf. Olaf looked at the mast. They understood each other without words. A boat. If they had a boat, they could go out to sea, fish farther from the cliffs, retrieve materials from the seabed, maybe even reach the nearest reef for stone and ore. The barrel was full. Ethan split it open with a hatchet. Inside was salted meat. Salted meat packed tightly and drenched in fat. He sniffed. It smelled fine, not rotten. Bridget tasted it. Edible. A month's supply of food. Tom found another gift in the pile of fins. A piece of fabric rolled into a tight tube. Canvas. Thick. Wet but intact. About 5 meters. Enough for a sail for a rowboat. For the next 20 days, Ethan and Olaf built a boat. Olaf worked with wood. Ethan worked with iron. Olaf carved frames from the wreckage. Ethan forged staples and nails for the planking. Olaf bent the planks over steam. Ethan built a steam chamber out of bamboo and stones, a pipe with hot steam, a plank inside. An hour later, the wood bent like putty. Olaf had never seen anything like it. He looked at the steam chamber and shook his head. Then he said that in 40 years of work, he'd bent planks by soaking them for 3 days at a time. And here, it took an hour. Ethan shrugged. Physics. Steam softens the lignin. The wood becomes pliable. Olaf didn't know the word lignin, but he remembered the principle. The yalak turned out small and a bit crooked. 4 meters long, 1 meter wide. A single bamboo mast. A sail made from found canvas. 2 oars carved by Olaf. Ethan caulked the cracks with a mixture of melted fat and wood fibers. Olaf checked every seam. On the 135th day, they launched the yalak. It didn't sink. It bobbed at the dock. Small, ridiculous, but afloat. May took the helm. She steered the vessel. Any vessel, that's her skill. Ethan and Olaf at the oars. They went out to sea for the first time in 5 months. The rock was left behind. Ethan turned and saw his fortress from the water. The walls, the tower, smoke from the hearth. Bridget stood on the wall and waved. Tom was beside her. From a distance, the rock looked impossible. A stone fortress in the middle of the empty ocean. No harbor, no island, just rock and walls. Any sailor who saw this would think he'd gone mad. May steered the rowboat south. 2 hours later, they found the reef, an underwater ridge at a depth of 3 meters. May knew it was there.
She could tell by the color of the water. The reef had everything: corals, shells, seaweed, and, most importantly, the remains of something metallic jutted out of a crevice in the reef. Ethan dove in. The cold water stung his skin. He opened his eyes. An anchor lay at the bottom of the reef. Old, rusty, huge. 50 kilograms of iron. He couldn't lift it. Not today. But he knew the anchor was there. 50 kilograms of iron. You could forge anything out of that. Absolutely anything. They returned to the rock by evening. Ethan sat on the pier and thought. The dinghy, the reef, the anchor. The world was expanding. The rock wasn't a prison. The rock was a base. For the next 2 weeks, he lifted the anchor, piece by piece. He broke it up on the reef with a hammer and chisel, diving 10 times a day. Each time he hauled up a fist-sized chunk of iron. Heavy, painful. But the iron was growing in the forge, a pile of rusty scraps that he remelted in the furnace and reforged. The furnace was too small for that much metal. Ethan rebuilt it. A bigger chamber, bigger bellows. Olaf made new bellows out of wood and leather. Real blacksmith's bellows with a valve, not made from bird bones. From planks and oxhide found in the shallows. The temperature in the furnace rose. The iron melted faster. Ethan forged. Nails, staples, hinges, hooks, chains, spikes, and an anvil. A small anvil made from a single piece of iron, with a horn and a platform, rough but real. When the hammer struck the anvil for the first time, the sound was clear and ringing, like a bell. Olaf heard that sound and said that a smithy had appeared on this rock, a real smithy. Ethan nodded. Then he forged the first object on the new anvil, not a tool, not a weapon. A wooden comb. The handle made from a fragment of a mast, the teeth made of bone, the frame of forged iron, thin as a thread, polished to a satin sheen. He placed it on a rock next to May while she slept. In the morning, she found it. She picked it up, ran it through her hair. The teeth glided through the tangled strands easily and softly. She looked at the comb, then at Ethan. He was pretending to be busy with his drawings. May said nothing, but from that day on, she always wore the comb. On the 150th day, Ethan began a project that transformed the rock from a refuge into a fortress. A cannon. Not a real ship's cannon. That would require tons of iron and bronze, but something capable of firing. He knew the principle. A tube, closed at one end. Gunpowder. A projectile. Ignition. The problem was the gunpowder. Saltpeter. Sulfur. Coal. There was coal. He found sulfur in volcanic rock on the underwater part of the cliff, yellow crystals in the pores of the basalt. Not much, but enough to start with. Saltpeter, potassium nitrate, formed in areas where organic waste accumulates. For 2 months, Ethan had been collecting fish waste in a stone pit and covering it with ash. Now there was a white coating on the pit's walls. He scraped it off, dried it, ground it into powder. Saltpeter. Dirty, weak, but real. He mixed the components in the proportions he remembered from his course in the history of fortifications. 75 parts saltpeter, 15 parts coal, 10 parts sulfur. The mixture was gray,
and lumpy. He poured a pinch onto a stone and held a coal from the furnace to it. A flash. White smoke. The smell of sulfur. Gunpowder. May stood 3 paces away and flinched at the flash. Then she looked at Ethan with an expression he had seen before. A mixture of fear and respect. She asked what it was.
He said it was a defense. He had cast the barrel from an anchor's iron, not a full-fledged cannon, a small mortar, a short, thick-walled barrel on a wooden carriage, the caliber of an apple. The projectile was a stone ball shaped into a sphere. Range, 150 meters. Accuracy? Non-existent. But at 150 meters, you can hit a ship. The ship is big. The first test shot. Ethan loaded the mortar on the south wall. He poured in the gunpowder. He inserted the projectile. He lit the fuse. Everyone stood behind the wall. Olaf covered Tom's ears. Bridget watched from the doorway. May stood next to Ethan. He lit the fuse. 3 seconds of silence. Then a roar. The mortar jumped on its carriage. A cloud of white smoke covered the wall. The shell flew into the ocean and fell about 100 meters from the cliff, sending up a fountain of water. Ethan watched the fountain. 100 meters. The charge is a bit weak. We need more saltpeter, cleaner. But the principle works. Their cliff now has artillery. The system reacted instantly. A new category, defensive systems, a bonus to fortification. The rank didn't go up, but Ethan felt that B was already cracking. One more step, and it would move to A. On the 160th day, another group with people, 2 of them, a young woman and a girl. The woman's name was Abigail Tatch. Everyone called her Abby. 19 years old, red hair, tangled and dirty. Her left arm, from the elbow to her fingertips, was covered in old burn scars, tight, shiny skin. She kept her arm in her sleeve and wouldn't let anyone look. A girl was with her, Ha-un, 17 years old, small, quiet, clinging to Abby and not letting go. Dark eyes, empty and distant. They had swum out of the hold of a slave ship that had run aground on a reef and sunk. Abby was from one of the islands. Ha-un was from the hold. Abby heard a knock and pulled her out. They had clung to a plank for 2 days. Ethan took them in as he took everyone in. Water, food, warmth, a place. Bridget took care of them. She washed them, changed their clothes, fed them. Abby ate greedily and talked a lot, loud, sharp. Words poured out of her like sparks from a forge. She told her story in a single evening. Her father was a blacksmith on Bear Bay Island, the best blacksmith in the archipelago. Pirates came for tribute. Her father refused. They set the smithy on fire. Her father stayed inside. Abby ran out. Her left hand was burning. Since then, she hadn't been able to hold a hammer. Her hands shook. Every time she saw the fire in the forge, something inside her tightened, and her fingers stopped obeying her. Ethan listened and looked at her hand, at the scars, at how she hid her palm. Ha-un didn't say anything, because she didn't speak, at all. Not a word. She knew her name, that was all. Where she was from, how long she'd been captive, what they'd done to her. Silence. She followed Abby like a shadow. Then Ethan, clinging to the hem of his shirt, not grabbing, not pulling. She just held it with 2 fingers. Ethan felt that light touch and didn't pull away. On the 3rd night, he woke up to find someone standing over him. Ha-un. She stood in the darkness and looked at him. She didn't move. She just stood there, checking that he was still there. Ethan understood. The fear of being left alone, a primal, animalistic. The fear of a child who had been abandoned too many times. In the morning, he sat down at the workbench and worked for 2 hours. He cast a small bell out of brass, the size of a thimble.
The sound was thin and clear. He tied it to a string. To the other end of the string, he tied a second, larger bell. The string was long, about 20 meters. He threaded it through the bamboo rails on the walls. He placed the small bell next to Haun's bedding. He hung the large one above his own. Then he sat down next to her and showed her. He pulled on the string. The big bell jingled. Ethan pointed at himself, then at the bell, then at her. "If you're scared, pull it. He'll wake up, he promises." Haun looked at the bell. Then she took it in her palm, squeezed it, looked at Ethan. For the first time ever, he saw something other than emptiness in her eyes. Recognition. A person who won't leave. On the first night, she tugged the cord 4 times. Ethan got up every time. He came over, sat down next to her. He said nothing. She fell asleep. He returned. On the second night, 3 times. On the third, twice. A week later, once a night. A month later, every other night. The system didn't register the bell. A small object, simple. But Ethan knew it was the most important thing he'd done on this rock. Abby. It was harder with her. She looked at the horn and turned away.
She looked at the hammer and clenched her hands. She wanted to forge. Ethan saw it. He saw her walk up to the forge and stand in the doorway. How she looked at the fire. How her fingers moved, repeating the motions her father had taught her. And how they trembled afterward, and she pulled her hand behind her back. He didn't say anything to her, didn't offer to let her try, didn't give advice. Instead, he spent 2 nights working on the hammer. Not an ordinary one, a special one. The handle was made of mahogany, hard and smooth. But the shape of the handle was carved to fit Abby's left hand, to fit her burned palm, with indentations where she had scars, with a protrusion under the base of her thumb where the skin was tight and wouldn't bend fully, with a soft leather wrap where the burn was sensitive to pressure. He had seen her hand, memorized every scar, every curve. The hammer would fit that hand like a glove, like an extension of her palm. In the morning, he placed the hammer on a rock next to the mountain. He just set it down, didn't say a word, went to work on the wall. Abby found him an hour later. His eyes were red, the hammer in his hand, in his left. The burned one. His hand wasn't shaking. She stood there and looked at Ethan. Then she said she hated him. Then she turned and walked toward the forge. 10 minutes later, the sound of a hammer striking an anvil rang out from the smithy. Olaf lifted his head from his work and smiled. Bridget peeked out of the house. May stood on the wall and looked down at Ethan. He was laying stones and pretending not to hear, but his hands were shaking too. But not from fear. Ethan had created gunpowder and cast the first mortar, giving the rock artillery. On the 160th day, Abby, the daughter of the slain blacksmith with a burned hand, and Haun, the silent girl from the hold of a slave ship, arrived. Ethan made Haun a bell attached to her bed so she could call him at night. For Abby, he carved a hammer shaped like her scorched left palm, and she began to forge again. 7 people on the rock: Ethan, May, Olaf, Bridget, Tom, Abby, Haun. Everyone found their place. May is the navigator and translator. Olaf is the carpenter. Bridget handles the kitchen and daily life. Tom is the jack of all trades. Abby the blacksmith. Haun, Ethan's shadow. And Ethan, the architect. The builder, the mastermind of the whole operation. On the 170th day, he unfolded May's map in front of everyone and sketched a plan on top of it. The walls will be taller, 2 meters instead of 1.5, with battlements on top, loopholes every 3 meters, a southern wall with a gate, a real one, on wrought iron hinges, a second tower at the southwest corner, a watchtower,
with a platform for a mortar, double the size of the dock, a stone breakwater on the southern approach. Olaf listened and nodded. Abby listened and forged nails for the gate. May listened and made notes on the map. Bridget listened and counted the food supplies. Tom listened and memorized everything. Haun stood next to Ethan and held onto his shirt. Work began the next day and didn't stop. Ethan calculated every stone, mortar firing angle from the new tower, dead zones, crossfire if a second mortar were placed on the old tower, observation sectors. He drew on flat stones with charcoal, and May transferred the drawings to paper they had made from soaked seaweed and wood pulp. The paper was rough and gray, but it was possible to write on it. Olaf was building the gate. Massive. 3 layers of oak planks laid crosswise, fastened with iron staples. Ethan forged the hinges himself. Each weighed 2 kilograms, made of anchor iron. The gate was installed on the 180th day. It closed with a heavy, dull thud. A bolt made from a single log. Ethan pushed the gate with his shoulder. They didn't budge. Olaf pushed from the other side. They didn't budge. They exchanged glances and nodded. It holds. Abby hammered without stopping. The hammer pounded the anvil from morning till night. Nails, brackets, hinges, hooks, spikes for the spurs. She hammered quickly and roughly, not as neatly as Ethan, but faster. Her hands remembered her father's teachings. Her body remembered even when her mind forgot. Her left hand no longer trembled. The hammer with its handle under her palm had become a part of her. She slept with it by her side. On the 191st day, the first foreign ship came to the rock. Not a wreck, not a skiff, a ship. A single-masted sloop. Black hull, a tattered sail. A carved figure of a wolf on the bow. May was the first to see it from the tower. She turned pale. She went down to Ethan and said one word. Pirates. Ethan climbed the tower and watched. The sloop was coming from the south, slowly, cautiously. They spotted the rock and were approaching to scout it out. On deck, Ethan counted 6 of them, armed, sabers at their belts. One had a musket. They were looking at the walls and the tower. Then even from a distance he could see their faces go pale. A stone fortress in the middle of the empty ocean. This wasn't supposed to happen. The sloop approached to within 200 meters. It stopped, dropped anchor. One of the pirates stood at the bow and shouted something. May translated. He's asking who owns this rock and by what right. Ethan looked at the mortar on the wall, loaded, with a fuse. Then he looked at the sloop. 200 meters, a bit far, but worth a try. He shouted back. May translated. The owner of this rock is Ethan Carver, by right of the builder. The pirate shouted something else. May translated, frowning. He says these waters belong to the Black Anchor, and all the cliffs, too, and he demands the gates be opened. Ethan turned silently toward the mortar. He raised the fuse, brought it to the ignition hole. A roar. Smoke. The cannonball arced through the air and fell into the water 20 meters from the sloop, sending up a column of water. A warning shot. The sloop rocked on the wave. On deck, people began to scramble. Ethan looked at May. She stood there, pale, but she didn't look away. He said, "First shot. Next one into the side." May shouted. There was silence on the sloop for about 10 seconds. Then they began to raise the anchor. 5 minutes later, the sloop turned and headed south, quickly. The sails filled with wind. Ethan watched as it sailed away. Then he looked at his crew. Olaf stood at the gate with an axe. Bridget was in the house with Tom. Abby was by the horn with a hammer. Ha-Yun was behind Ethan. May was nearby. 7 people, 1 mortar, and the news that these 6 would carry south. That there was a fortress on an empty rock in the bone wasteland, with a cannon, with a man who shoots without warning. Ethan knew they would return. Not 6. More. Far more. For the next 30 days, he worked harder than ever. A second mortar, cast from the remains of anchor iron, mounted on a new tower. Crossfire. If a ship approaches from the south, both mortars strike it simultaneously.
Underwater stakes. Sharpened bamboo trunks driven into the seabed at the approach to the rock. Their tips half a meter below the surface, invisible from the water, but they'll rip through a ship's keel. May showed where the channel runs, and Ethan drove stakes on both sides, leaving a single narrow passage. Anyone who doesn't know the passage will run aground on the stakes. False embrasures. Ethan cut 10 embrasures into the wall. Behind 4 of them stood mortars and men. Behind the other 6, nothing. But the enemy doesn't know which embrasure has a cannon. They'll have to check them all. Oil traps. Fish oil collected over months. 4 barrels. Pour it into the water by the wall. Set it alight. Burning oil on the water. Any boat, landing craft, or raft will catch fire. Ethan was setting up the defenses, and his mind was working like a computer. Angle, distance, reload time, ammunition count, gunpowder supply, cannonball supply, fallback points, last line of defense. May stood nearby and took notes. She didn't understand half the terms, but she wrote everything down. Olaf was building shields for the walls, thick planks that would protect the gunners from musket fire. Abby was forging pikeheads, long bamboo poles with iron tips, to defend against boarders on the walls. Tom was hauling stones and stacking them on the walls, stones to drop on the heads of the bishes. Ha-Yun helped Bridget stock up on food and water. They were getting ready. On the 220th day, May woke Ethan at dawn. Sails on the horizon. Not 1, 3. 3 ships were coming from the south in formation, 2 sloops and a brig. Ethan climbed up to the tower and counted. 3 ships, 20 to 30 men on each, 70 against 7, 10 to 1. He came down and gathered everyone. He spoke briefly. Olaf at the gate, axe in hand. If they break through, hold the passage. Abby on the south tower. Mortar number 1, fire on command. May on the north tower, observation, adjustment. Bridget and Tom inside the house. Prepare water for firefighting and bandages. Ha-Yun with them. No one argued. No one asked why. 7 months on the rock. They trusted Ethan. The ships approached within 200 meters and stopped. A black flag with a white anchor was raised on the brig. Graves' men. Someone shouted from the deck. May translated. Surrender the fortress and the master, in exchange for their lives. Ethan stood on the wall and watched. Then he turned to Abby. He said one word. Foremast. Abby took aim. She lit the fuse. A roar. The cannonball flew and struck the mast of the forward sloop. The wood cracked. The mast tilted. The sails went limp. The sloop lost speed. The second sloop surged forward, straight into the stakes. It crashed into 3 bamboo trunks at once. The hull creaked, water poured into the hold. The sloop began to list. People jumped overboard. The brig fired a volley from its broadside, 4 cannonballs. 1 struck the wall. Rocks rained down. The wall held, but a crack formed. The other 3 missed. Ethan moved to the second mortar. He took aim. He fired. The cannonball struck the brig's side below the waterline. A hole, a small one, but the brig began taking on water. The pirates lowered 3 rowboats, 25 men. The oars moved quickly. They were heading for the rock. Ethan shouted, "Oil!" Bridget and Tom rolled the barrels onto the wall and tipped them over. Fish oil flowed down the rocks into the water. It spread into a film. Ethan threw a torch. The water burst into flames. A wall of fire rose between the rock and the rowboats. The heat hit their faces.
The flames roared. The rowboats stopped. The rowers recoiled from the fire. One rowboat caught the burning film. The side caught fire. People jumped into the water. The fire burned for about 15 minutes. Then it died down. The grease had burned out, but the boats had retreated. The brig was sinking slowly. The first boat stood mastless. The second lay on its side on its keel. The pirates picked people out of the water and sailed away. The brig was the last to go, listing heavily to starboard. Ethan stood on the wall and watched them leave. His hands were shaking. His legs were shaking. The adrenaline was wearing off, and his body was beginning to realize what had just happened. May walked over and stood beside him. She was silent. Abby sat by the mortar, stroking the barrel with her burned hand. Olaf stood by the gate with an axe on his shoulder and smiled for the first time in a long while. Bridget was hugging Tom. Ha-Yun came out of the house and walked over to Ethan. She grabbed his shirt. He placed his hand on her head. The system flashed. Craft rank increased. Changed to A.
Advanced fortification unlocked. Ballistics unlocked. Siege engineering unlocked. Rank A, 7 months. 1 nail, 7 people, 3 sunken ships. The rumors spread across the ocean. On an empty rock in the Bone Wasteland stands a fortress that cannot be taken. 3 weeks of silence followed the battle. Ethan repaired the wall. Olaf patched the cannonball hole. Abby reforged the damaged staples. May watched the horizon. The silence was deceptive, and they all knew it. 3 sunken ships meant 3 captains who would return to Grave and tell him, and Grave would send more. But before Grave arrived, Cordelia did. On the 245th day, a ship appeared from the northwest. Not a pirate ship, a frigate. White sails with a blue albatross. The Royal Navy. May recognized the flag and said it was the Albatross. The frigate approached cautiously. It stopped 300 meters away. A rowboat was lowered. In the rowboat were 4 oarsmen and a woman. The woman sat upright, like a dark hair tucked under a hat, a dark blue dress, a corset, gloves. In the middle of the ocean, in a rowboat, in a corset and gloves. The rowboat pulled up to the dock. The woman climbed the steps without taking the rower's outstretched hand. She stood before Ethan. She looked him over from head to toe. A dirty shirt, burned hands, a beard, calluses. Then she surveyed the walls, the towers, the horn, the mortars on the walls. Then she introduced herself. Lady Cordelia Ashford, envoy of His Majesty King Albatross, authorized to offer Master Carver the title of Royal Engineer and the barony of Bone Wasteland in exchange for loyalty to the crown and a commitment to build for the royal fleet. Ethan listened to May's translation. Then he asked what he would receive besides the title. Cordelia listed it: a stipend, materials, protection from the royal fleet, and the right to trade under the Albatross flag. Ethan asked what he would lose. Cordelia hesitated. Then she said that he would be subject to the crown. He would build what he was ordered to build. He would live where he was told to live. Ethan looked at his walls, at the tower, at the horn from which smoke was rising, at May and Abby and Olaf and everyone else. Then he said no. He was neither a mercenary nor a subject. He was the master of this rock. If the king needs his help, let him come as an equal, not as a master to a servant. Cordelia looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded. She said she would pass on the answer. She turned toward the rowboat. Then she stopped. She looked at the walls once more, at May's bay window with its mica pane, at the bamboo staircase, at the hinged door, at the fish rack, at the smoke from the hearth. Ethan saw something flicker in her face.
for a second. Then the mask returned. She got into the rowboat and rowed away. The frigate sailed off to the northwest. Ethan thought he would never see her again. He was wrong. 2 weeks later, the same frigate returned. This time Cordelia came alone, without oarsmen. She sailed up in a small rowboat, in the same dress, in the same corset, with a single trunk. She stepped onto the pier. She looked at Ethan. She said the mission had failed. The king had rejected her. Carver's proposal for an equal partnership had offended the court. She had been recalled. But she had nowhere to return to. In a month, she was to be married to the Duke Westfall, a 60-year-old man. A political alliance. She ran away. Ethan looked at her, the king's envoy. An aristocrat who had fled her own wedding to a rock in the middle of the ocean. He asked why she was here. Cordelia was silent. Then she said that as she stood on this rock and looked at the walls, for the first time in 10 years, she saw a place that someone had built because they wanted to. Not because they were ordered to, not because it was profitable, because they wanted to. Ethan nodded. He pointed to an empty spot in the house. She went inside, sat down on a stone bench, straight as a mast, in a corset. An hour later, Ethan saw her surreptitiously loosening the lacing and wincing. A day later, he placed a corset on her table, not made of fabric and whalebone, made of leather, soft, tanned leather, with hinged inserts of iron and brass. The inserts allowed for movement, to bend over, to breathe deeply. And yet, it held its shape. A corset for a person, not a mannequin. A note lay nearby. He'd asked May to write it. "You can breathe in this." He measured her while she slept in the chair. He asks her not to be angry. Cordelia picked up the corset. She looked at the hinges, at the leather, at the note. Then she sat down on the bed and cried, quietly, covering her face with her hands. 10 years in a corset that wouldn't let her breathe. 10 years of a straightened back and constricted ribs. And now the man she'd been seeing for 3 days had made something that no one in 30 years had thought to make. A corset you could live in. She stayed. The system lit up. Personalized object. Bonus doubled. Ethan was no longer surprised. He understood the rule. A thing for a person. Always for a specific person. 8 people on the rock. Cordelia fit in unexpectedly quickly. She didn't know how to build, didn't know how to forge, didn't know how to fish, but she knew how to do other things. Organize, count, plan, negotiate, drafting documents, speaking 4 languages, knowing the laws and customs of the 5 archipelagos. She became what Ethan was missing, an administrator. He built, she managed. Within a week, she had compiled an inventory of everything on the rock, every nail, every plank, every stone in the wall. In 2 weeks, she developed a duty roster and assigned responsibilities. In 3, she created a system to track water and food consumption. Ethan watched her work and shook his head. For 3 years, he had built alone. Then with helpers. But no one had kept track. No one had planned. No one had thought about tomorrow beyond dawn. Cordelia thought a month ahead, 3 months, 6 months. She asked Ethan how many nails he could make in a month. He said 500. She asked how many nails were needed for a ship. He said 3,000. She said that meant he could build a ship in 6 months. Ethan stopped. He looked at her, then at the pier, then at the ocean. A ship. She's right. He has the iron, wood, tools, craftsmen. He could build a ship, a real ship, not a rowboat. A ship. On the 270th day, Jung Yuri came to the rock. Not on a wreck, not on a rowboat. On a pirate skiff she'd stolen that night from beneath the Black Anchor's frigate. Small, dark-skinned, black hair cut short, a hoodie down to her heels hiding her body. She spoke quickly and in 5 languages, switching between them mid-sentence. The first thing she told Ethan was that they would come for her. She had been a medic on a pirate ship for 3 years, not by choice. They'd captured her on Pearl Coast Island and forced her to treat the crew. In 3 years, she'd learned everything: how to stitch wounds,
set bones, prepare fever potions, and brew poisons. She said this straight out, without a pause. She knows poisons, knows which one kills in an hour, which one in a day, which one in a week. And she fears that this is the only thing she's really learned. Ethan listened and said nothing. Then he asked why she had run away. Yuri said the ship's captain had fallen ill. She cured him. Then he ordered her to poison a prisoner from another ship. She refused. He struck her. That night, she stole a rowboat and left. She sailed for 3 days, navigating by the stars. She saw a lighthouse. Ethan nodded. Then he pointed to the cliff. He asked what she saw. Yuri looked at the walls, the towers, people. She said she saw a place where they could hide. Ethan shook his head. He said not to hide, to live. Yuri looked at him and, for the first time during their conversation, fell silent for a long time. A week later, Ethan climbed onto the roof of the South Tower, the highest point on the rock. The wind, the sun, a view of the ocean in every direction. He worked for 2 days. Stone walls around the perimeter of the roof, soil made from a mixture of clay dug from the reef and crushed seaweed. Drainage holes in the walls, bamboo stakes for climbing plants, and a door with a lock. 1 key. He gave the key to Yuri. She stood and looked at the garden, empty for now, bare earth and bamboo sticks. But a garden. Her garden. With a lock. Ethan said that no one would enter here except her. Whatever grew would be hers, to nurture or to weed, her choice. He doesn't ask. Yuri stood there holding the key, a small iron key on a string. Then she said quietly that in 22 years of life, no one had ever given her a key to anything. She planted the first seeds the next day. Grasses from the reef and the coastal rocks, seaweed that can be grown on land. A month later, the roof of the tower was green, a small garden in the middle of the ocean. Yuri went up there every morning. She locked the door. She worked. She came down with a bunch of herbs and a quiet half-smile. Cordelia noted that the consumption of medication had halved since Yuri's arrival. Bridget stopped complaining about pain in her scar. Olaf said that the joints on his prosthetics hurt less. Yuri healed silently and effectively. 9 people on the cliff. And the cliff was no longer a cliff, a citadel. Ethan uttered that word on the 280th day, standing on the tower with May. Carver's Citadel. May looked at him. She asked why Carver and not something beautiful. Ethan said that Carver was his last name, and this was his rock, and his walls, and his people. May said quietly that the people weren't his, they were their own. Ethan was silent. Then he said she was right. Carver Citadel, where everyone belongs. On the 291st day, the last one arrived. Sylvia North. Syl. 25 years old, former gunner in the Royal Albatross Fleet. Tall, broad-shouldered, no left eye, black eye patch, short-cropped hair, a voice like an anchor chain on the deck. She arrived alone on a royal launch, said she'd deserted. Ethan asked why. Syl said she'd been ordered to fire on a fishing village because the village hadn't paid its taxes. She refused. She was stripped of her rank. She stole the boat and left. She'd heard about the rock with the fortress from the captain of that sloop that Ethan had chased away with his first shot. She decided this was the place for her. Ethan asked what she could do. Syl said she could shoot, any caliber, any distance. With one eye. He took her to the South Tower and showed her the mortar. She took a look. She touched the barrel.
She checked the carriage. She examined the ignition hole. Then she said the elevation angle was wrong, that the mortar was set with a 2-degree roll to the left, that the shells were flying with a systematic error. Ethan looked at the mortar, then at Syl, then back at the mortar. She was right. He set the carriage by eye, a 2-degree error. At 100 meters, that's a 3-meter deviation. He'd seen the misses but didn't understand why. Syl spotted it in 10 seconds, with one eye. 2 weeks later, Ethan gave her a gift, a monocular rangefinder, a bamboo tube with a lens made of polished quartz found on the reef. Inside there was a scale made of thin wire. The graduations were calibrated for a mortar. He aimed at the target, read the distance, adjusted the angle, fired. Syl took the rangefinder, looked through it, aimed at the rowboat tied to the dock, read the distance. Then she looked at Ethan for a long time. Said that if he ever did something like that again, she'd kiss him. Just a warning. Ethan turned away.
Abby stood in the doorway of the smithy and laughed. 10 people, counting Olaf, Bridget, and Tom. Workshop, smithy, infirmary, garden, administration, artillery, navigation, kitchen. And the builder at the head of it all. Carver's citadel had become a reality. Joining them on the rock were Jung Yuri, a runaway herbalist from a pirate ship, and Sylvia North, a deserter and gunner from the Royal Navy. Ethan built Yuri a private garden on the tower's roof, with a key just for her. Sylvia received a monocular rangefinder calibrated for a mortar. The crew had grown to 10 people. The rock was officially named Carver Citadel. Year, 365 days. Ethan stood on the top platform of the lighthouse and looked at what he had built. Walls 2 meters high around the entire perimeter of the rock. 2 towers. 4 mortars. A gate on wrought iron hinges. A pier with a breakwater. A smithy with an anvil. A workshop with a workbench and a full set of tools. A desalinator producing 5 liters of fresh water a day. A greenhouse, a small one, 2 by 3 meters. A bamboo frame. Walls of oiled canvas that let light through. Inside, soil from the reef. Yuri grew greens and root vegetables in it. Not much, but fresh food. Vitamins. 27 people were already living on the cliff. After the battle with the 3 ships, word spread quickly. Some were afraid, others came. Fishermen who had lost their villages, sailors from wrecked merchant ships, families fleeing pirates. Everyone came to the light of the lighthouse, and Ethan took everyone in. Cordelia kept track. 27 mouths to feed. So much water per day. So much fish. So much grain from the supplies brought by the last group of refugees. The supplies would last 40 days at the current rate of consumption. We need more. Ethan thought in terms of scale. Not a single day, not a single month. A year. 5 years. The desalinator needed to be scaled up. 5 liters wasn't enough. We need 50. He completely rebuilt the system. Not just 1 basin and 1 tube. A battery. 5 basins on a single stove. 5 condenser tubes. A stone reservoir for collection. Olaf built a wooden water tower. A tank at the top. Bamboo pipes leading down. Gravity drives the water to the faucets. 2 faucets. 1 in the kitchen, 1 in the bathhouse. The bathhouse. Ethan built the bathhouse on the 370th day. A 2-by-2 stone room. A furnace outside heats the stones. Stones inside. Water on the stones. Steam. Heat. Purity. When May first stepped into the hot steam and sat down on the stone bench, she sat there for an hour. She came out red and wet with teary eyes. Not from the steam, because the last time she had washed in hot water was a year ago. Cordelia entered the bathhouse and came out a different person, literally. Without a corset, without a hat, in a simple shirt,
with her hair down. Olaf saw her and didn't recognize her. Yuri washed quickly and left quietly. Syl bathed noisily and sang. Abby bathed for a long time and cried because the hot water didn't burn her scars, but soothed them. Haun bathed only when Ethan promised to stand outside the door. Every new convenience changed people, not because convenience is a luxury, but because convenience is dignity. A person who washes in hot water feels like a person, not a fugitive. A person who sleeps under a roof feels at home. A person who has their own comb and their own cup and their own place at the table feels that someone needs them.
Ethan wasn't building a fortress. He was building a home. The fortress took shape on its own because a home needs to be protected. On the 400th day, Ethan began building a ship. Olaf oversaw the carpentry. Abby forged the fasteners. Ethan designed it. May advised on seaworthiness. Syl chose the locations for the gun ports. Cordelia calculated the materials budget. Yuri prepared the first aid kit for the ship. Even Tom worked. He was 13 and hauled planks and planed boards with a tenacity that frightened his mother. The hull was growing on the dock. The keel was a single log. The frames were made of bent wood. The planking was held together with copper rivets. Ethan had obtained the copper from an underwater deposit that May had found a mile from the rock. He dived there in a rowboat every week. The ship was small, 12 meters, 1 mast, 8 gun ports, 4 on each side. The cannons haven't been cast yet, but the ports are ready. Ethan named it the Nail. May snorted. Syl laughed. Cordelia raised an eyebrow. Abby said it was the perfect name. Yuri said that naming a ship after a nail was either genius or madness. Haun silently ran her finger along the hull and smiled. The ship was built over 5 months, every day, no days off. Olaf said he'd built many ships over 40 years, but had never seen a design like this. A double bottom, watertight bulkheads, ballast tanks. Ethan explained each element. The double bottom is for safety. If the outer hull is breached, water will fill the space between the bottoms, but won't get inside. The bulkheads divide the hold into sections. If one is flooded, the ship stays afloat on the others. Olaf listened and nodded. Then he said that if they'd built ships like this back in the day, half the sailors in the world would still be alive. Ethan said nothing. On the 420th day, May came to him at night. He was sitting on the roof of the workshop, drawing by the light of an oil lamp. She sat down beside him. She was silent. Then she said he hadn't slept for 3 nights. Ethan said he had a lot of work. May said the work wouldn't run away. Ethan said it would run away if he didn't finish it in time. May asked what he wouldn't finish in time. He was silent for a long time. Then he said that every person on this rock had come because they had nowhere else to go. That every one of them was broken. That he was the only one who could give them walls and a roof and safety. And if he stopped for even a day, someone would die because he hadn't finished in time. May was silent. Then she said quietly that he wasn't a god, that he was just one person, that if he didn't sleep, he'd die before anyone else, and then who would build? Ethan looked at her. She looked straight at him, without turning away, without fear. She had long since stopped turning away from things that frightened her. He said he couldn't stop, that if he stopped, he'd think, and if he thought, he'd remember. His mother, home, the phone on the table, the call he never made. May placed her hand on his shoulder, gently. She said she wouldn't go anywhere, that the rock wouldn't go anywhere, that the walls were standing, and that he could sleep. He could. Ethan closed his eyes. His head fell onto the blueprints. He fell asleep in 10 seconds. May sat next to him and looked out at the ocean. The lighthouse shone above her head. She wasn't afraid of the water. She hadn't been afraid
for a long time.
She was afraid that the man next to her would break before his walls did. The ship Gvozdi was launched on the 530th day, a year and a half on the rock. Olaf struck the wedge with a hammer. The hull slid down the grease-lubricated guides and entered the water with a dull splash. It swayed. It leveled out. It sat straight. It wasn't sinking. It wasn't listing. The water line was exactly where Ethan had calculated. 27 people stood on the pier and watched. Silence. Then someone shouted. Then everyone. Tom was jumping up and down. Bridget was crying. Olaf stood with a hammer in his hand and smiled so widely that his beard bristled. Abby was pounding her fist on the pier railing and screaming something incoherent. Syl stood straight and nodded. Professional approval. Cordelia was writing down the date and specifications. Yuri threw a bunch of herbs into the water for good luck. Ha-un stood next to Ethan and spoke for the first time ever. Beautiful. Ethan looked at her. She looked at the ship, then at him, then back at the ship. Ethan placed his hand on her head. She didn't pull away. May stood at the helm of the rowboat next to Gvozdi and checked the draft. She shouted that everything was clear. They could raise the mast. It took 2 days to set the mast. Olaf carved it from the straightest log they'd found all year. Bridget sewed the sails from canvas found in the wreckage and bought from a passing merchant. A merchant? The first merchant arrived at the rock on the 491st day. An old captain with a schooner full of salted fish. He'd heard of Carver's citadel, heard that there was no robbery here, that you could repair a ship here, that there was a master here who made things that no one else made. Ethan repaired his rudder in 2 days. The merchant paid with a piece of sailcloth, a sack of grain, and 3 chickens. The chickens were a sensation. Ha-un fed them every morning and every evening. Eggs appeared a week later, fresh eggs. Bridget made an omelet and cried. Cordelia drew up the first price list. Hull repairs, anchor forging, refilling water supplies from the desalinator, navigation charts from May, medicine from Yuri. Every service had a price, not in gold, in materials, wood, iron, cloth, food, seeds, tools. Gold is cheaper here than fresh water. That's how the world works. After the first merchant came the second, the third. By the 500th day, 9 ships had passed through the citadel. Small traders, fishermen, 1 smuggler. Everyone paid. Everyone left with repaired ships and full barrels of water. And everyone talked about the rock. The rumor spread. Carver's citadel. A free port. Not a pirate port. Not a royal port. A free port. After the launch of the Nail, Ethan began building a second ship. And a third. Olaf took on apprentices from among the new settlers. 2 former carpenters from the ravaged islands. They built the hulls under Olaf's guidance, following Ethan's blueprints. Abby took on an apprentice, a boy with a broken arm that Yuri had set and splinted. 2 months later, he was forging nails as well as Tom. The forge ran 2 shifts. On the 550th day, the citadel had 3 ships, the Nail, Hook, Plum, all named after tools. May commanded the Nail, Syl commanded the Hook. The Plum was commanded by a former boatswain named Dagmar, who had come to the rock with a broken leg and curses for the pirates who had taken his ship. 34 people lived on the rock. The walls had been expanded. A second level of buildings stood on a stone foundation. Barracks, a warehouse, Yuri's infirmary, Cordelia's office, Abby's smithy, Olaf's workshop. And at the center of it all, the lighthouse tower. The fire burned every night, no longer on fish oil, on oil that produced less soot and more light. Yuri had learned to extract oil from seaweed grown in her garden. Ethan felt the system pressing down from within.
Rank A was bursting at the seams. Every new project, every ship, every mechanism, every personalized item. It was all coming together. It was all piling up. He felt that the next S rank was close. One big project, one breakthrough. On the 560th day, he found it. Not up above, down below, under the rock. Ethan was widening the foundation for a new wall on the west side. He struck the basalt with a pickaxe, and the pickaxe fell into the void. He widened the opening, shone his torch inside. Beneath the rock was a cavity, a cave. No, not a cave, a hall. A stone hall with smooth walls. The walls were not natural. They had been carved, crafted. There were lines on them.
Thin grooves forming patterns. Ethan climbed down inside. The torch illuminated the walls 3 meters around. The hall was large, 10 meters across. The ceiling was vaulted. The floor was level. In the center of the hall stood a stone slab. Symbols were carved into the slab. Not letters, not numbers. Something else. Geometric shapes inscribed within one another. Circles within squares within triangles. And right in the center of the slab was a depression, small, round, the size of a finger, the size of a nail. Ethan stood in front of the slab and felt the hairs on his arms stand on end. He knew that feeling. The system. The system was humming. Not through the interface, through the stone, through the air, through his bones. He took out of his pocket the object he always carried with him. A small pin, reforged 200 times, polished to a shine. Once a rusty nail, that very first nail. He held it up to the indentation. The pin trembled in his fingers. Ethan didn't insert it, not now. He wasn't ready yet. But he understood. The rock wasn't random. The nail wasn't random. He wasn't random. Everything was connected, and something down below was waiting. Ethan didn't tell anyone about the chamber. Not right away. At first, he went down alone, every night, with a torch and a notebook made of homemade paper. He sketched the symbols from the walls. He studied the slab. He touched the recess with his finger. The pin in his pocket trembled every time he approached. On the third night, May noticed he was gone. She didn't ask where he was going, she just waited at the entrance until he returned. She looked at his face, at the dust on his knees, at the torch in his hand. Then she said quietly that he had that look again. "What look?" Ethan asked. "The look of a man who has found a new wall that needs to be built," May replied. He told her. Then Cordelia, then Yuri, then everyone. They went down to the hall together, 10 people with torches. Orange light on the smooth walls. The symbols played with the shadows. Olaf ran his hand along the wall and said that this stone was 1,000 years old, maybe more. The craftsmanship is perfect. He doesn't know of any tool that could cut basalt like this. Cordelia studied the symbols and said she'd seen similar ones in old books in the Royal Library. Legends of the first builders. The civilization that existed before all the archipelagos, before all the kingdoms, before the pirates. They built lighthouses all across the ocean. Then they vanished. The lighthouses sank. Craft system remained, like a legacy with no one to pass it on to. Yuri said that among the pirates, stories circulate about ancient treasures at the bottom of the ocean. Ships that can sail without wind, walls that cannot be broken, weapons that shoot light. She always thought they were just tall tales. Syl said she didn't care if it was ancient or not. The main question was simple. Is it dangerous or useful? Ethan stood in front of the stove and thought. Then he said he didn't know, but he was going to find out. On the 570th day, he began clearing the rubble. 3 corridors led out of the hall. 2 were blocked with stone. The third led downward. Ethan and 4 volunteers cleared the debris by hand. A pickaxe, a shovel,
Buckets of stone carried upstairs, slow, heavy work. The first corridor led to a smaller hall, empty. Just walls with symbols and a stone trough in the floor, a water channel, an ancient water supply system. Ethan followed the channel.
It sloped downward and ended in the wall. A splashing sound could be heard from behind the wall, an underground freshwater spring. He broke through the wall. Water gushed into the trough, clean, cold, fresh. Not desalinated, real, fresh water from an underground spring beneath the rock. Ethan stood knee-deep in the water and laughed. The water problem was solved for good. A second corridor led to a storage room. Stone shelves lined the walls. Nothing on the shelves. Everything had been taken out or had decayed over 1,000 years. But on one shelf in the corner lay an object, small, metal, covered in patina. Ethan picked it up and turned it over in his hands. A mechanism. Gears. Springs. A casing made of a metal he didn't recognize. Not iron, not bronze, not brass. Something else. Lighter. Stronger. He tried to turn a gear. It wouldn't move. 1,000 years without lubrication. He brought the mechanism upstairs, took it apart, cleaned it, lubricated it, put it back together, turned the gear. It worked. The mechanism clicked and lit up. A quiet blue glow emanated from the cracks in the casing. The system flashed before his eyes, brighter than ever. Artifact of the first builders detected. Analysis. Beacon navigation compass. Function. Determines the coordinates of all active and dormant beacons within a radius of 1,000 nautical miles. Status. Damaged. Repairs required. Ethan held the compass and his hands were shaking. Beacons. Other beacons. His rock isn't the only one. There are others. Dormant. Sunken. Waiting. If he repairs the compass, he'll find out where they are. If he finds them. If he activates them. He didn't think any further. Too soon. Too dangerous. Too vast. He hid the compass in the workshop and returned to the immediate task at hand. Because the immediate task was simple and clear, and what awaited below was vast and terrifying. The third corridor led deeper. Ethan didn't clear it out, not yet. There was something else there. He could feel it. The system could feel it. The pin in the vibrated more strongly with each passing day. He went back upstairs and built, because that's what he knows how to do. Because upstairs, people were waiting who needed walls and a roof and food. Because what lay below could wait, but people couldn't. On the 600th day, May brought the nail to Crosstide Harbor. The Citadel. Carver's first official trade voyage. She returned 10 days later with a hold full of goods: iron, wood, cloth, grain, seeds, tools, and information. Grave knows about the Citadel. Grave is preparing a fleet, not 3 ships, 7, 2 frigates and 5 sloops, 200 men, cannons, boarding parties. He's coming to wipe the rock off the map. May relayed this calmly. She was no longer afraid of the ocean. She feared for the people on the rock. Ethan listened and nodded. Then he went to the drafting table. He had been preparing for this from day one. Every wall, every tower, every mortar, every underwater stake, everything had been built for this moment, for the day when the real enemy would come. Ethan explored the underground hall and discovered 3 corridors leading to the ancient chambers of the first lighthouse. An underground source of fresh water was found, along with a mechanical compass from the first builders indicating the coordinates of other lighthouses. The third corridor remained unexplored. The Citadel's first trade voyage brought goods and news. Captain Grave is assembling 7 ships to destroy the fortress. Ethan spent 30 days preparing the defenses. He slept no more than 4 hours a day. May brought him food to the tower because he forgot to eat. Cordelia drew up an evacuation plan in case the walls fell. 3 ships, 34 people. Women and children on the Nail, men on the Loop and the Plum. Head northwest toward the Albatross. Ethan looked at the plan and said there would be no evacuation. The walls won't fall. Cordelia looked at him and said that an evacuation plan is needed precisely by those who are certain they won't need it. And Ethan said nothing. Then he nodded. The defense was multi-layered. First line, the underwater stakes had been extended. Now they blocked all approaches to the cliff except for one narrow channel from the south. Second line, mines. Not real mines. Wooden barrels stuffed with gunpowder and stones, tied to underwater stakes. The fuses led to the surface through a hollow bamboo tube, lit by a torch from the pier. Third line of defense, 6 mortars on the walls, plus 2 new guns. Ethan had cast 2 long-barreled falconets with rifled barrels. Range 300 meters. Accuracy twice that of the mortars. Sela saw the rifling in the barrel and looked silently at Ethan. Then she said she'd warned him, and kissed him, on the cheek, quickly. She went over to the gun. Ethan stood there, red as a beetroot. Abby called out from the smithy that she'd seen it, the 4th echelon, oil traps around the perimeter. The 5th, loopholes in the walls for crossbowmen. Ethan made the crossbows, 6 of them, with a block and tack mechanism for cocking. Even Tom could fire them. 6th. The gate was reinforced with iron strips and propped up by a stone buttress. A battering ram wouldn't take it. Ethan stood on the tower and looked at his defenses. Then he looked at the people. 34 men, 20 of them capable of handling a weapon, 5 of them trained marksmen. Against 200. 10 to 1. Again. But this time he had walls, cannons, mines, fire, and men who knew what they were fighting for. Day 630. Almost 2 years. Sails on the horizon. May counted 7, 2 large frigates, 5 sloops. Black sails with a white anchor. Graves' fleet. Ethan went down to the hall, gathered everyone, spoke briefly, assigned positions. Sills on the main tower with a falconet. Abby on the south tower with a mortar. May on the observation deck with a spyglass and a megaphone. Olaf at the gate with an axe and 4 fighters. Yuri in the infirmary. Cordelia with Bridget and the children in the fortified basement. Tom handling ammunition. Ha-Yoon. Ethan looked at her. She stood quietly. 18 years old. Not a little girl. A quiet woman who had learned to read and write in a year and was helping Cordelia with the paperwork. She looked at Ethan and spoke her second word ever. "I'll help." Ethan nodded. He put her in charge of reloading the crossbows. The fleet had closed to 400 meters. It formed a semicircle. 2 frigates in the center, ships on the flanks. Ethan counted the cannons. 42 guns on their side, 8 on his. 5 to 1 in firepower. But his walls were made of stone. Their hulls were made of wood. A boat was lowered from the flagship. 1 man, tall, black cloak, black hat. He walked toward the pier without haste. Ethan went down and stepped out onto the pier, alone, unarmed. The man in black climbed the steps, stopped 2 paces away, looked at Ethan. Gray eyes, a tanned, hard face, a scar running from his temple to his chin. Captain Bartholomew Grave, the Black Anchor. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten, he spoke quietly. May stood on the wall and translated. Grave said he hadn't come to kill, he'd come to talk. He knows who Ethan. He knows what he's building, and he knows that what he's building is more dangerous than any pirate fleet. Ethan asked what was so dangerous about a fortress that threatened no one. Grave replied that a fortress isn't just walls. A fortress is an idea. The idea that you can put down roots in the middle of the ocean, that you can build a home on the water, that you can stop.
But the ocean isn't meant for stopping. The ocean is for moving. Ethan listened. Then he said that the ocean is vast. There's enough for those who move and those who stand still. Grave shook his head. He said that Ethan didn't understand, that he hadn't built a fortress, but a lighthouse, and that it's not just hope that comes into the world. Greed comes into the world, power, control. In 10 years, his free port will become a capital, in 20, a kingdom, in 50, an empire. And then the ocean would die. Ethan was silent. Then he said that wasn't his problem.
His problem was 34 people who needed a roof over their heads. Grave nodded. He said he respected that, but he couldn't allow it. He turned and walked toward the rowboat. Ethan returned behind the walls. He climbed the tower. He raised the megaphone. Grave hadn't reached the flagship yet when the first boat moved forward. "Mines!" Ethan shouted. Tom lit the fuse. The barrel exploded underwater. A column of water and debris shot up 5 meters. The boat was thrown back. The hull was pierced. Water gushed inside. The second boat avoided the mines but ran aground on the stakes. The third came to a stop. The fourth opened fire. Cannon's balls flew toward the walls. One struck the tower. Stones rained down. The second passed through the embrasure and smashed a supply crate inside. The third hit the wall and got stuck. The wall held. Ethan shouted into the megaphone, "Sill, -3 degrees." The flagship's foremast. Sill aimed the falconet through the rangefinder, read the distance, adjusted the angle, fired. The cannonball flew in a low arc and struck the flagship's mast. The rifled barrel provided a level of accuracy never seen before. The mast cracked and collapsed onto the deck, crushing men and sails. The flagship lost speed. Abby. Second volley in 12 seconds. The waterline of the second frigate. Abby reloaded the mortar. Tom handed her a cannonball. She took aim. Fired. Hit. Below the waterline. The frigate began to list. Yuri. Smoke from the eastern wall. Yuri had set fire to a barrel of wet seaweed. Thick white smoke billowed along the wall, obscuring their positions. The pirates fired blindly. The cannonballs flew past. 3 boats with boarders were heading for the dock. Oil. Bridget and 2 fighters emptied the barrels. Fire on the water. The boats retreated. One caught fire. The battle lasted 4 hours. Ethan was in the tower, at the drafting table, with a megaphone. He didn't fire. He didn't fight. He commanded. Every shot at his command, every volley calculated, every movement coordinated. The enemies were fighting against the system, not against a man, against the system he had built over 2 years, stone by stone. By sunset, Graves' fleet had retreated. Of the 7 ships, 4 were leaving. 2 sloops lay at the bottom. The frigate was sinking slowly, listing to one side. The flagship, without a mast, was barely crawling along on oars. Graves stood at the stern and looked at the rock, at the walls, at the lighthouse, at the smoke. Then he turned and went into the cabin. An hour later, a shot rang out from the flagship. 1. May lowered her spyglass and said quietly that Grave had shot himself. Ethan stood on the tower, hands on the railing. A cut on his cheek was bleeding. His legs wouldn't hold him. He sat down on the steps. Everyone was around him. May was nearby. Sill was on the wall with a falconet. Abby was at the mortar. Olaf was at the gate. Yuri was in the infirmary, bandaging the wounded. Cordelia was leading people out of the basement. Bridget was hugging Tom. Haun stood next to Ethan. She wasn't holding on to his shirt. She stood on her own. He looked at her. She looked at him, silently. But her eyes said it all. They had won. The morning after the battle, Ethan stood on the lighthouse platform and watched the sunrise.
The sky was orange and pink. The ocean lay calm after yesterday's fire. Debris and black patches from the burning oil, smoke from the sunken ships drifted toward the horizon. The cut on his cheek had dried. His hands were covered in soot. His clothes reeked of gunpowder and smoke. May stood nearby. She leaned against the railing and looked out at the ocean, without turning away. Sila sat on the steps, her back against the wall. Falconet was beside him. The bandage over her left eye had slipped, and she adjusted it without looking. Abby sat with her legs crossed, twirling a hammer in her hands. That very one, with the handle under her scorched palm. Cordelia stood upright, in a corset with hinges. Her hair was pulled back, her back was straight, but her eyes were red. She had been counting the casualties all night. 3 wounded, 1 seriously. Yuri hadn't slept. She had been stitching and bandaging until dawn. Now she had climbed up to the landing with a potion of herbs in her hands. She handed it to Ethan. He drank it without looking. Bitter, hot. Ha-un stood quietly, beside him, not behind him, beside him. She had grown over the past year, not physically, inside. The silent girl from the hold had become a silent woman who could reload a crossbow in 30 seconds. 6 people on the lighthouse platform, 31 people below. Everyone was alive. Everyone, Ethan counted. He counted again. 34, including him. Everyone was alive. The walls held. The system held. The people held. He looked at his hands. The same calluses, the same scars. Plus new ones. Lots of new ones. A small white scar on his palm from the first rusty nail. That's where it all began. 630 days ago. 1 man on bare rock. 1 nail. The system. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out the pin. That very one, reforged 200 times, shiny, warm to the touch, always warm, even in the cold. He held it in his palm and thought. Then he looked down, at the walls, at the towers, at the pier where 3 ships bobbed, at the smithy from which smoke rose, at the workshop where Olaf was already planing a new plank, at Yuri's garden on the roof, at May's bay window, at every stone he had laid with his own hands, every wall for someone, every embrasure for a specific hand, every staircase for a specific foot. He wasn't building a fortress. He was building a home for specific people, which just happened to turn out to be a fortress. May quietly asked what he was thinking about. Ethan said he was thinking about the basement, about the stove. About a nail-sized indentation. May nodded. She knew, they all knew, that something was waiting beneath the rock, something ancient and enormous. Ethan climbed down from the tower. He walked across the courtyard, past the smithy where Abby was already stoking the forge, past the infirmary where Yuri was checking on the wounded, past the office where Cordelia was writing a report on the battle, past the workshop where Olaf and Tom were planing boards to repair the wall, past the kitchen where Bridget was cooking porridge for 34 people. He nodded to everyone. Everyone nodded back to him. Not as a commander, as a neighbor, as the man who had built their home. He went down to the basement, down the stone steps, a torch in one hand, a pin in the other. The hall was quiet and echoing. The symbols on the walls flickered faintly, or so it seemed to him. He approached the slab, stood before it. He looked at the recess, round, deep, exactly for the pin. He knew what would happen when he inserted it. He didn't know the details, but he knew the gist. The system would recognize him. The beacon would awaken.
The ancient mechanism beneath the rock would start up for the first time in 1,000 years, and something would change, forever. Grave was right about one thing. It's not just hope that comes to light. Ethan stood there thinking. Then he heard footsteps behind him. He turned around. May. Behind her, Syl, Abby, Cordelia, Yuri, Haun. All 6 of them. They had come down after him. They stood in a semicircle behind him. May said that if he was going to do something on which the fate of the world depended, he shouldn't at least do it alone. Syl said she'd cover him, though she didn't know from what. Abby said that if it broke, she'd fix it. Cordelia said she'd document it. Yuri said that if anyone feels sick, she's here. Haun didn't say anything. She walked over and stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder. Ethan looked at them, 6 women. Each had come to this rock broken. He had gathered them all, not fixed them, not healed them. He gave them a tool, a place, and time. They put themselves back together, and now they stand here, with him. He turned to the slab. He picked up the pin, a small, shiny piece of iron, a former rusty nail, the first object. The last pin of the first lighthouse, fallen 1,000 years ago. He inserted it into the recess. The pin went in, precisely, tightly, like a key in a lock. Silence. A second, 2, 3. Then a sound came from beneath the rock. Not a rumble, not an explosion. A low, deep hum. A vibration that traveled not through the air, but through the stone, through the bones, through the teeth. The slab lit up. Lines on the walls flashed one after another. Blue light raced upward along the grooves, through the ceiling, through the foundation, through every stone Ethan had laid with his own hands over 2 years. The light traveled along the walls of the bastion, along the towers, along the pier, along every block, every joint, every slab. People upstairs ran out of their houses and watched. Blue lines flowed down the walls, thin, bright, like the morning sky. The light rose toward the lighthouse, toward the lantern, toward the bowl of oil. The oil flared up, not yellow, blue, a bright blue flame. The lighthouse beam struck the ocean, not the scattered light of an oil lamp, a beam, focused, powerful. It cut through the morning mist and headed toward the horizon. Ethan went upstairs. He stepped out onto the landing. The lighthouse burned blue above his head. The walls of the citadel glowed with blue lines. People stood in the courtyard looking up. Olaf dropped to his knees. Tom clung to his mother. Bridget held him close. Ethan looked toward the horizon. The beam was heading south, far away, beyond sight. And somewhere out there, very far away at the very edge of the world, something answered. A faint, flickering glimmer, like a star lighting up over the water. Another lighthouse. A second one. Sleeping for 1,000 years, awoken by the signal of the first. May climbed onto the platform, stood beside him, looked at the horizon, quietly said she could see the light. Ethan nodded. She asked what he had built. Ethan looked at his palm, at the small white scar from the first rusty nail, then at the walls, at the towers, at the ships at the pier, at the people in the courtyard, at the 6 women standing nearby and watching him, then at the ocean, boundless, dark, full of dangers and wonders, and on the horizon, a second light, small and distant, waiting. He said it seemed to have only just begun. The system flashed one last time. Kraft's rank was upgraded.
And changed to S. Ancient engineering unlocked. Lighthouse architecture
unlocked. Awakening, unlocked. Ethan closed his eyes. The wind blew in his face, salty and cold, just like on the first day. Only now there were walls behind him, and people, and the fire burning in the lighthouse for the first time in 1,000 years. He opened his eyes and smiled. May stood nearby, Syl on the steps, Abby in the doorway, Cordelia with a notebook, Yuri with herbs, Haun silent nearby. Down below, Olaf was hammering. Bridget was calling everyone to breakfast. Tom was running across the courtyard. 34 people on a rock in the middle of the ocean. 1 nail, 2 years, and a whole world ahead. The morning after the battle, Ethan went down into the underground hall and inserted the pin, the former first nail, into a recess in the stone slab. All 6 girls went down with him. The ancient mechanism of the first lighthouse awoke. A blue light swept across every stone of the citadel and lit the lighthouse with a blue flame for the first time in 1,000 years. The beam reached the horizon, and at the edge of the world, a second dormant lighthouse responded.
The system was upgraded to rank S with the discovery of ancient engineering and lighthouse architecture. Ethan Carver's story on the cliff is just beginning.